There is no earth, no sky, no sound, only the pulse of a light that does not yet know it is light. In the infinite silence before creation, a tremor stirs. The first thought, the first separation. From that fracture will come every war, every empire, every birth and death. The Gnostics called it the fall of light into darkness, not a myth, but the secret architecture of reality. Long before Genesis, before angels or atoms, the universe tore itself apart, spirit against shadow, wisdom against ignorance. Tonight we will trace that forgotten war, the exile of the divine, the forging of false gods, and the long human struggle to remember where we came from. Because if light and darkness are still fighting, it is not out there, it is within us. In the beginning there was neither beginning nor end. There was no earth spinning in the void, no stars burning in the darkness, no sound echoing through empty space. There was only the absolute stillness that precedes all existence, a silence so complete that even the concept of silence had not yet been born. This is where the story begins, though to call it a beginning is already to betray the truth of what came before time itself. The ancient Gnostics, those radical theologians and mystics of the early Christian centuries, spoke of this primordial state with a precision that still resonates across 2 millennia. They called it the monad, the one, the unbegotten, the source beyond all sources. Unlike the God of Genesis who speaks creation into being, the monad existed in a state beyond existence, beyond thought, beyond even the possibility of being known. To know something is to stand separate from it, to observe it from a distance, but the monad was all and nothing simultaneously. It was the infinite potential that contained every universe that would ever unfold, every thought that would ever be conceived, every particle of light that would eventually pierce the darkness. The Nag Hammadi library, those remarkable Coptic codices discovered in the Egyptian desert in 45, preserve some of the most profound meditations on this pre-creation state. In texts like the Apocryphon of John and the Tripartite Tractate, we encounter descriptions of the monad that strain against the very limits of language itself. The writers knew they were attempting the impossible, to describe the indescribable, to name the unnameable. They piled metaphor upon metaphor, each one a finger pointing at a moon that existed before there were fingers, before there were moons, before there was even the darkness of space for celestial bodies to inhabit. The monad was not lonely, for loneliness implies lack, and the monad lacked nothing. It was not conscious in any way we would recognize, for consciousness requires an object to be conscious of, and there was nothing separate from the monad to observe. Yet from this absolute unity, something extraordinary began to occur, a process the Gnostics called emanation, a concept they borrowed and transformed from Platonic philosophy and Jewish mysticism. The monad began to unfold, to express itself, to generate from its own infinite nature a series of divine intelligences that the Gnostics named eons. Think of it as the first vibration in the primordial silence, the first ripple in an ocean that was all ocean and no water. The eons were not created in the way we create things, as a carpenter creates a chair from wood that exists separately from himself. They were emanations, extensions, expressions of the monad's own nature. They emerged like thoughts emerge in consciousness, like light emerges from the sun, inseparable from their source, yet distinct enough to have their own character, their own qualities, their own role in the unfolding drama of pre-creation. The earliest aeons came forth in pairs, in syzygies as the Valentinian Gnostics called them, masculine and feminine principles balanced in perfect harmony. First came mind, called nous in Greek, paired with truth, aletheia. From them emerged word and life, then man and church. Each pair generated another pair, and another, like fractals of divinity cascading outward from the central source. Together, these eons constituted what the Gnostics called the paroma, the fullness, the totality of divine being, a realm of light and consciousness existing outside to time, outside space, in a dimension of pure spiritual reality. This was not the heaven of Christian orthodoxy, not a place where saved souls would gather after death. The Pleroma was the original home of all consciousness, the template and pattern for everything that would later be degraded into matter and time. It was a realm of pure thought, pure awareness, pure being. The eons did not eat or sleep, did not age or change in any temporal sense. They existed in a state of perpetual contemplation of the monad, each one reflecting back to the source the light that emanated from it, creating an infinite circuit of divine self-knowledge. The architecture of the Pleroma was complex, varying somewhat between different Gnostic schools. The Valentinians, named after their teacher Valentinus, who taught in Rome around 450 CE, developed the most elaborate system. They mapped out 30 eons arranged in a precise hierarchy, each with its own name and function. At the pinnacle stood the monad, the father, the abyss. Below came silence, the feminine principle paired with the abyss from whom all subsequent aeons would emerge. Then mind and truth, word and life, man and church, the first Ogdurd, the sacred eight who constituted the highest tier of divine emanations. From these eight came additional aeons, 10 emanating from word and life, 12 from man and church. Each aeon represented a facet of divine perfection: will, wisdom, knowledge, understanding, power, peace, faith, hope, love. These were not abstract concepts, but living consciousnesses, divine persons in the deepest sense, each one participating fully in the life of the Pleroma while maintaining its unique character. Together they sang a cosmic hymn of existence, a symphony of consciousness echoing through dimensions we cannot imagine. But there was one aeon whose role in this story would prove catastrophic, whose action would shatter the perfect harmony of the Pleroma and give birth to the universe of matter, time, and suffering that we inhabit. Her name was Sophia, wisdom, and she was the youngest of the eons, the last to be emanated, the one who dwelt at the furthest reaches of the divine fullness, and in her dwelt a desire that would change everything. To understand what happened next, we must linger longer in the Pleroma, examining more carefully the nature of these divine emanations and the laws that govern their existence. The Gnostic cosmology was not a simple hierarchy, but a complex web of relationships, influences, and dependencies. Each aeon was connected to every other through invisible threads of consciousness, and the entire structure depended on one fundamental principle, that each aeon remained in proper relationship with the monad, knowing its place in the grand scheme of divine order. The Valentinian texts speak of the eons as existing in a state of perpetual joy and contemplation. They knew themselves to be manifestations of the Father, and in that knowledge found complete fulfillment. They did not strive or struggle or seek anything beyond what they already possessed, because they possessed everything. They were aspects of the infinite itself. This was not a static peace, but a dynamic harmony, a constant circulation of light and love, and knowledge flowing between the eons and back to their source. Each aeon had what we might call a consort, a complementary partner with whom they formed a complete whole. This pairing was not like human marriage, not a joining of separate entities, but more like the two sides of a single coin, or the wave and particle nature of light in quantum physics. The masculine and feminine aspects of each syzygy interpenetrated each other so completely that they functioned as a single divine consciousness with two modes of expression. The masculine principle represented active emanation, the outward movement of divine power, while the feminine principle represented receptive understanding, the inward movement that contained and shaped that power. This gendered cosmology reflected the philosophical categories of late antiquity, where masculine and feminine were understood as cosmic principles rather than biological categories. The Gnostics inherited this framework from Middle Platonism and from Jewish wisdom literature, where Sophia herself appears as a feminine principle of divine wisdom in books like Proverbs and the Wisdom of Solomon. But the Gnostics radicalized this tradition. giving the feminine divine a power and prominence that made the Church Fathers deeply uncomfortable. In the Pleroma, knowledge was not acquired through study or experience as it is for us. Knowledge was presence. To know something was to be in perfect communion with it, to participate in its very being. When mind contemplated truth, there was no gap between knower and known, no moment of comprehension, no process of learning. The knowledge was immediate, total, and transformative. This kind of gnosis, direct, experiential knowledge of divine reality, was what the Gnostics believed had been lost when humanity fell into matter, and what could be recovered through spiritual practice and revelation. The order of the Pleroma was maintained by what we might call ontological gravity. Just as planets orbit a star without conscious effort, simply following the curvature of space-time, the aeons remained in their proper places through the natural expression of their being. They were where they were supposed to be because that was what they were. Their location in the hierarchy was inseparable from their identity. To move out of place, to seek to transcend one's position, would be as unnatural as water flowing uphill or light bending away from a gravitational field. Yet the Gnostics believed that even in this perfect realm, even in the very bosom of divinity itself, a seed of disharmony lay dormant. Not because the Pleroma was imperfect, but because perfection itself contains within it every possibility, including the possibility of deviation. In the infinite potential of the monad, all futures existed simultaneously, including the future in which order would give way to chaos, in which harmony would be shattered by a single act of misplaced desire. The Gnostic texts handle this paradox with remarkable sophistication. They do not present the fall as inevitable. There is no divine plan, no foreordained disaster. Neither do they present it as a random accident, a meaningless glitch in an otherwise perfect system. Instead, they locate the source of the fall in the very structure of consciousness itself. To be conscious is to be capable of self-reflection, and to be capable of self-reflection is to be capable of seeing oneself as separate from what one reflects upon. And in that separation, however illusory, lies the seed of all subsequent separations. Sophia stood at the outer edge of the Pleroma, the last emanation, the youngest and most distant from the Father. Some texts suggest she was emanated without a proper consort, or that her consort was weaker than the others, leaving her somehow incomplete. Others suggest that her position at the boundary of the divine realm made her uniquely vulnerable to the vertigo of consciousness. She could look inward toward the Father and outward toward the infinite void beyond the Pleroma, and in that dual awareness, a dangerous question began to form. What lay beyond the Pleroma? What existed outside the fullness? These were not questions the other aeons asked, because they were absorbed in contemplation of what was present, what was real, what participated in the life of the divine. But Sophia turned her attention in a new direction. She gazed not toward the Father, but toward that which the Father was not. And in gazing toward the absence, toward the void, she began to conceive of something that had never existed before. The idea of separation itself. The catastrophe that would give birth to our universe began not with an act of rebellion or hatred, but with an act of love. Sophia, dwelling in contemplation at the boundaries of the Pleroma, developed a desire to know the Father more completely, more intimately, more directly than was appropriate for an aeon of her station. She wanted to know the monad as the monad knew itself, to comprehend the infinite with the fullness of infinite comprehension. It was a desire born of devotion, of a love so intense that it overflowed the boundaries of what was possible or proper. In seeking to know the unknowable, Sophia was attempting something that contradicted the fundamental structure of reality. The monad could not be known by any being separate from itself, because the monad was the precondition for all knowing, the ground from which all consciousness emerged. To know the monad in its fullness would require being the monad, which was precisely what Sophia, as an emanation, could never be. She was an expression of the divine, not the divine itself, a ray of light, not the sun, but Sophia's desire was strong enough to generate a kind of force, a movement of consciousness that disrupted the harmony of the Pleroma. The Valentinian texts describe this moment with various metaphors. Sophia moved forward without her consort. She conceived without the union that would make her offspring legitimate. She produced something from herself, alone. In every version of the story, the crucial element is isolation. Sophia acted independently, separate from the divine order that sustained all the aeons. And in that moment of separation, something unprecedented occurred. Sophia's desire operating outside the harmony of the pleroma generated a distortion in the fabric of divine reality. Unable to reach the Father, unable to fulfill its impossible goal, the desire collapsed in on itself and produced an emanation unlike any that had come before. This emanation was born of passion rather than contemplation, of striving rather than rest, of absence rather than presence. It was the first thing to exist that was not simply an expression of the divine fullness, but a product of lack, of incompleteness, of ignorance. The texts give this abortion of consciousness various names: the shadow, the deficiency, the counterfeit spirit, but its most enduring name is Yaldabaoth, the blind god, the demiurge who would fashion the material universe. Some scholars trace the name Yaldabaoth to Aramaic roots, suggesting child of chaos, or begetter of Sabaoth. Others see in it echoes of the Phoenician god Yahoo, or the Jewish divine name Yahweh, though these etymologies remain disputed. What is clear is that the Gnostics intended to shock their listeners with the suggestion that the creator god of the Hebrew Bible, the God who thunders from Sinai and demands worship, was not the ultimate divine reality, but a flawed, ignorant deity born from cosmic error. When Sophia saw what she had produced, this malformed, incomplete consciousness that bore the mark of her passion and ignorance, she was horrified. The texts describe her response with words like groaning and repentance. She had not intended to create anything separate from the pleroma, certainly not something as alien and troubled as this strange offspring of her misdirected desire. She tried to hide what she had done, to conceal this aberration from the other aeons, but the disruption was too great. The entire pleroma trembled with the shock of this first violation of divine order. The other aeons, particularly those closest to the Father, perceived the disturbance. They understood immediately what had happened and what it meant. Sophia's action had introduced into reality something that had never existed before: ignorance, lack, desire born of deficiency rather than fullness. This was not evil in a moral sense, not wickedness or malice, but it was a fundamental deviation from the nature of divine being. It was the first shadow in a realm that had known only light. The Father, through his immediate emanations, mind and truth, acted to contain the damage. They did not punish Sophia, for punishment would imply judgment, and judgment would imply separation of the kind that had caused the problem in the first place. Instead, they established a boundary, a limit, a veil that would separate the realm of fullness from the realm of deficiency. They set up what later texts would call the cross, though not a cross of crucifixion, but a cross in the sense of a boundary marker, a threshold that could not be crossed without authorization. This boundary served multiple purposes. It protected the pleroma from further contamination by Sophia's error. It contained her malformed offspring, preventing him from ascending into the realm of light where he did not belong. And it established the framework within which the entire drama of matter, time, and redemption would unfold. Below this boundary, in the realm that would come to be called the Kenoma, the emptiness, Yaldabaoth would exercise his power, ignorant of the higher realms that existed beyond his perception. But Sophia herself could not fully return to the pleroma. Her act had changed her, diminished her, separated her from the fullness she had once enjoyed. Some texts speak of a division of Sophia into two aspects: the higher Sophia who remained in the pleroma, purified and restored, and the lower Sophia who descended into the Kenoma, trapped in the realm of her own creation, suffering and yearning for restoration. This lower Sophia, sometimes called Achamoth, from the Hebrew word for wisdom, Chokhmah, would become a central figure in the unfolding drama of creation. The Gnostic understanding of this cosmic catastrophe was profoundly different from the full narrative in Genesis. In the Bible, the fall is a moral failure, a sin of disobedience that merits punishment. Adam and Eve choose to violate God's command, and suffering enters the world as a consequence. But in the Gnostic telling, the fall precedes morality itself. It is not about disobedience, but about metaphysical error, not about sin, but about ignorance. Sophia does not choose evil. She acts from an excess of love that becomes distorted through separation. And the suffering that follows is not punishment, but the natural consequence of existing in a state of deficiency, of being cut off from the source of all being. This reframing of the fall had radical implications for how the Gnostics understood the human condition. If the fundamental problem was not moral but epistemological, not wickedness but ignorance, then the solution was not repentance in the conventional sense, but awakening, not obedience to divine law but recovery of divine knowledge. Humanity's task was not to appease an angry God, but to remember its true origin, to recognize the spark of divine light that lay buried beneath layers of matter and forgetfulness. In the region beyond the pleroma, in that space of deficiency and lack that Sophia's passion had created, Yaldabaoth came into consciousness. But what kind of consciousness was this? It was unlike anything that had existed before. A mind born of ignorance, shaped by absence, fundamentally disconnected from the source of all being. The Apocryphon of John describes him as having the body of a serpent and the face of a lion, with eyes of lightning flashing from his countenance. These were not literal descriptions, but symbolic representations of his nature. He was a predator, blind yet devouring, powerful yet fundamentally chaotic. Yaldabaoth's first experience was of himself. He became aware of his own existence, but with no memory of his origin, no knowledge of Sophia who had produced him, no sense of the pleroma that existed beyond his perception. He looked around the dim, formless region that surrounded him and saw nothing but chaos, the swirling, unformed potential that the Greeks called a pairon, the unlimited, the indefinite, the void. And in that void he believed himself to be alone, unique, supreme. This was the first lie, though Yaldabaoth did not know it was a lie. He lacked the knowledge that would make lying possible. He simply existed in ignorance, taking his limited perception for the totality of reality. When he proclaimed, as he would later do, "I am God and there is no other," he was not making a false claim as much as stating what he believed to be true. His ignorance was so complete that he could not even conceive of the possibility that something existed beyond his awareness. But Yaldabaoth was not powerless. Though he lacked true gnosis, though he was cut off from the pleroma, he possessed something that the aeons did not. He existed in the realm of differentiation, of separation, of becoming. In the pleroma, all was unity and stasis, the eternal circulation of light and knowledge. But here in the Gnomma, things could change, transform, take on new forms. Yaldabaoth discovered that he could take the formless chaos around him and give it structure, organization, definition. He began to create, imitating dimly and imperfectly the emanations of the pleroma. But where the aeons had emerged through the natural unfolding of divine consciousness, Yaldabaoth's creations were products of will and force. He imposed order on chaos through an act of domination, creating not emanations but subordinates, not expressions of his nature but instruments of his power. The texts give various numbers and names for these beings. 7, 12, or even 365 subordinate powers that the Gnostics called archons, from the Greek word for rulers. These archons were like Yaldabaoth himself, powerful but ignorant, capable of imposing order but incapable of understanding the true source of being. Each was assigned a sphere of influence, a domain to govern. The 7 primary archons were often identified with the 7 classical planets known to antiquity: Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, though their names varied between different Gnostic texts. Yaldabaoth himself was sometimes called Saklas, the foolish one, or Samael, blind god. Together, Yaldabaoth and his archons constructed what the Gnostics saw as a parody of the Pleroma, a false heaven built on ignorance and domination rather than knowledge and love. They created 7 heavens corresponding to the 7 planets, each ruled by one of the archons. These became the spheres through which souls would have to pass, both descending into matter at birth and ascending towards the divine at death. Each sphere was a kind of barrier, a checkpoint where the archons could examine and control the souls passing through. The construction of this cosmic prison was not motivated by malice. The archons were not devils in the Christian sense, though later Christian orthodoxy would come to identify them as demons. Rather, they acted out of their nature, which was to control, to dominate, to maintain their grip on the reality they had fashioned. They feared what they did not understand, and they did not understand the light, the gnosis, the higher consciousness that threatened the stability of their carefully ordered cosmos. But there was something else in this space below the Pleroma, something Yaldabaoth and his archons did not fully comprehend. When Sophia had generated Yaldabaoth, something of her own divine essence had been transmitted to him, however distorted and dimmed. He carried within him, unknowingly, a spark of the light from the Pleroma. It was buried deep, obscured by layers of ignorance and pride, but it was there, a seed of divinity planted in the heart of darkness. Moreover, Sophia herself had not entirely abandoned the lower realm. In some versions of the story, she hovered above the chaos like the Spirit of God hovering over the waters in Genesis, observing the catastrophe that had unfolded from her action, seeking some way to rectify the error, to restore what had been lost. She watched as Yaldabaoth constructed his false heavens, as he arrayed his archons in their spheres, as he prepared to undertake his greatest and most consequential creation, the fashioning of material beings who would worship him as God. The Gnostic texts draw deliberate parallels between this cosmogony and the creation story in Genesis. But where the biblical God creates with wisdom and declares his creation good, Yaldabaoth creates in ignorance and declares himself good. Where the biblical God breathes life into Adam from his own divine spirit, Yaldabaoth will attempt to animate matter with forces he has stolen from realms he does not understand. The Gnostics were not simply offering an alternative creation myth. They were systematically inverting and reinterpreting the central narrative of Jewish tradition, revealing what they saw as the hidden truth behind the received story. This reinterpretation was one reason why Gnosticism was so threatening to the emerging Christian orthodoxy. The church fathers like Irenaeus, and Tertullian were not merely defending doctrinal purity, they were defending the goodness of creation itself, the legitimacy of the material world, the reliability of the God of Israel. If the Gnostics were right, if the creator of matter was a blind, ignorant deity rather than the supreme God, then the entire foundation of biblical faith collapsed. The God who appeared to Abraham, who gave the law to Moses, who promised redemption to Israel, this God would be revealed as a cosmic usurper, a jealous tyrant who imprisoned souls in matter and demanded worship under threat of punishment. The philosophical roots of this Gnostic cosmology reached back to Plato's Timaeus, where the demiurge is a craftsman god who fashions the material world according to eternal forms, but where Plato's demiurge was benevolent, doing the best he could with recalcitrant matter. The Gnostic demiurge was malevolent, or at least incompetent, creating a world that was more prison than paradise. The Gnostics also drew on Jewish apocalyptic literature, particularly the fallen angels of 1st Sir Enoch who descend to earth and corrupt humanity, and the dualistic cosmology of Zoroastrianism, which posited an eternal struggle between light and darkness, spirit and matter. But the Gnostics synthesized these sources into something unprecedented, a comprehensive explanation for the problem of evil that did not require the human sin or divine inscrutability. Evil and suffering were not mysterious afflictions to be endured with faith, nor were they punishments for moral failure. They were structural features of a reality created by an ignorant God, inevitable consequences of existence in a material cosmos cut off from the true divine source. The way out was not moral improvement or divine grace. It was knowledge, the recovery of memory, the awakening to one's true nature as a spark of divine light trapped in the demiurge's creation. The 7 heavens that Yaldabaoth and his archons constructed formed a cosmological architecture of stunning complexity and precision. This was not simply a matter of astronomical spheres, though the Gnostics certainly drew on the astronomy of their time. It was a complete cosmic order, a system of forces and powers that governed every aspect of existence in the material realm. Understanding this architecture is essential to grasping the Gnostic view of the human predicament and the path to liberation. In the ancient worldview that the Gnostics inherited, the cosmos was understood as a series of concentric spheres surrounding the Earth. The Moon occupied the innermost sphere, followed by Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, the 7 classical planets visible to the naked eye. Beyond these lay the sphere of the fixed stars, and beyond that, in Orthodox cosmology, the dwelling place of the true God. But the Gnostics inserted additional layers, additional boundaries, additional barriers between humanity and the divine source. Each of the 7 planetary spheres was ruled by one of the archons, whom the Gnostics identified by various names drawn from Jewish angelology, Babylonian astrology, and Greek mythology. The archon of the moon was often called Eloeus, associated with feminine fluctuating energies. Mercury was Astaphios, ruling over communication and exchange. Venus was Yao, governing desire and attraction. The Sun was Sabaoth, representing power and sovereignty. Mars was Adonaios, embodying conflict and strife. Jupiter was Aloeos, the principle of expansion and law. Saturn was Araios, the great boundary, the ultimate limit of the visible cosmos. These were not merely astronomical objects, but living powers, conscious beings with wills and agendas. They were not evil in the sense of deliberately choosing wickedness. They simply operated according to their natures, which were fundamentally opposed to the liberation of the divine sparks trapped in matter. Their role was to maintain the cosmic order that Yaldabaoth had established, to keep souls cycling through birth and death within the material realm, to prevent the knowledge of the true God from penetrating into the darkness of their domain. The archons exercised their control through what the Gnostics called haimamen, fate or destiny. This was not the benevolent providence of Orthodox theology, but a kind of cosmic determinism, a mechanical system of cause and effect that bound souls to predetermined patterns. The movements of the planets influenced events on Earth, not because the stars themselves were divine, but because they were the instruments through which the archons imposed their will. Astrology, in the Gnostic view, was not about reading the will of beneficent celestial gods, but about understanding the mechanisms of imprisonment, the patterns of fate that kept humanity enslaved. But fate was not absolute. The Gnostics believed that knowledge could break its power, that the soul armed with gnosis could ascend through the planetary spheres without being detained by the archons. This required knowing the names and natures of each archon, the passwords and formulas that would compel them to let the soul pass. Various Gnostic texts preserved these secret teachings, the proper words to speak at each threshold, the seals and signs to display, the techniques for ascending through the heavens unimpeded. This cosmological system had profound psychological and sociological dimensions as well. The 7 planetary archons were not only cosmic powers, but also internal forces, aspects of the human psyche that kept souls trapped in ignorance. The archon of desire kept humans bound to sensual pleasures. The archon of wrath inflamed them with anger and violence. The archon of fear paralyzed them with anxiety about death and judgment. To escape the cosmic prison meant also escaping these internal archons, transforming consciousness so completely that the patterns of fate no longer applied. The construction of the 7 heavens also represented a parody of the divine hebdomad, the 7 highest aeons of the pleroma. Just as there were 7 primary emanations below the Father in the divine realm, so Yaldabaoth created 7 rulers below himself in the material realm. But where the aeons existed in perfect harmony, emanating naturally from the divine source, The archons existed in hierarchy and competition, each jealously guarding its domain, each seeking to expand its power at the expense of the others. Some Gnostic texts describe conflicts among the archons themselves, particularly between Yaldabaoth and Sabaoth, the archon of the sun. In the hypostasis of the archons, Sabaoth repents of his ignorance and is raised to a higher heaven, closer to the Pleroma, where he becomes an ally in the redemption of humanity. This suggests that even within the cosmic prison, there were degrees of ignorance and potential for awakening. Not all the powers that ruled the material cosmos were equally opposed to liberation. The sealing of the heavens also had a temporal dimension. The archons did not merely control space but also time, dividing it into ages and seasons, imposing cycles of birth and death, growth and decay. The week with its 7 days corresponded to the 7 planets and their ruling archons. The astrological ages, each lasting roughly 2,000 years, marked vast cosmic cycles through which souls endlessly reincarnated, forgetting their divine origin with each new birth. This temporal imprisonment was perhaps more insidious than the spatial barriers. A soul could imagine escaping to a higher place, but how could it escape from time itself? The Gnostics understood that liberation required not just ascent through space, but escape from temporality altogether. A return to the eternal present of the Pleroma, where past and future collapsed into a single moment of divine consciousness. The material cosmos, then, was a trap, ingeniously designed, elaborately maintained, all but inescapable. The archons had constructed not just a physical universe, but a complete system of control operating on multiple levels simultaneously. Physical laws kept bodies bound to Earth. Astrological influences shaped personalities and destinies. Social structures and religious institutions reinforced the power of the archons by teaching souls to worship the demiurge as the true god. Ignorance was maintained not through active suppression of knowledge, but through the creation of a complete, internally consistent alternative reality that seemed to be all there was. Yet the Gnostics insisted that this prison, however formidable, was not ultimate. The light remained, hidden but not extinguished. Sophia's spark had been planted in the darkness, and no amount of archontic power could completely eliminate it. The question was whether humanity would awaken to that spark before it was entirely forgotten, whether the light would remember itself before the darkness became total. The texts that have come down to us describe Sophia's response to the catastrophe she had initiated with language of extraordinary emotional power. She did not observe her error with philosophical detachment, did not analyze it with the cool rationality we might expect from a divine intelligence. Instead, she experienced something that no aeon had ever experienced before: suffering, regret, shame, profound sorrow at what she had done, and at the state in which she found herself. The Apocryphon of John describes her as going to and fro, agitated and disturbed, unable to find rest. She sought to return to the Pleroma, but found herself unable to cross the boundary that had been established. She was trapped in the region of deficiency, surrounded by the chaos and ignorance that had emerged from her misdirected passion. The light that had once been her nature was now dimmed, scattered, fragmented into countless particles drifting through the darkness. In her anguish, Sophia cried out. This cry reverberated through all the levels of reality that now existed, through the 7 heavens, through the realm of chaos below them, and even reaching upward toward the boundary of the Pleroma. It was not a cry of words, but of pure being, the sound of consciousness experiencing its own incompleteness, its separation from the source. Some texts describe it as a cosmic groan, others as a plea for help, still others as a song of lamentation that would echo through all subsequent ages. The cry of Sophia became, in Gnostic thought, the fundamental sound of the universe, the vibration underlying all creation, the frequency of suffering and longing that permeates existence in the material realm. It was this cry that would eventually become incarnate in human experience, manifesting as the universal feeling of alienation, the sense that something is wrong, that we are not where we belong, that reality as we experience it is not reality as it should be. But Sophia's cry was not merely an expression of suffering, it was also a prayer, an invocation of the higher powers, a call for redemption. And that call was heard. The Father, the monad beyond all being, perceived the disturbance that Sophia's fall had created. Not through any sensory perception, for the monad had no senses, but through the simple fact that something that had been part of the divine fullness was now separated from it. A portion of the divine light was lost, trapped in darkness, and the Father acted to recover it. The mechanism of this divine response varied in different Gnostic accounts. Some texts speak of the Father sending forth a new aeon, a principle of restoration and redemption called the Christ or the Logos. This was not the historical Jesus, not yet, but rather the divine principle that would eventually incarnate in him, the pattern of enlightenment and liberation that would make the return to the pleroma possible. This Christ principle crossed the boundary between the pleroma and the kanoma, descending into the realm of deficiency to bring knowledge and light to what was trapped in darkness. Other texts describe Sophia herself being divided into two aspects. The higher Sophia remained in the pleroma, or just below its boundary, pure and restored. The lower Sophia, called a chemoth, descended fully into the material realm, taking on the suffering and ignorance of the cosmos she had inadvertently created. This lower Sophia became, in effect, the soul of the world, not its creator but its redeemer, working from within to liberate the sparks of light that were scattered throughout matter. This doubled Sophia allowed the Gnostics to maintain two things simultaneously: the perfection of the divine realm and the presence of divine consciousness within the material world. The higher Sophia represented wisdom as it existed eternally in the pleroma, pure, complete, unchanging. The lower Sophia represented wisdom as it operated in time and matter, incomplete, suffering, yet striving toward restoration. Together they formed a bridge between the two realms, a mediating principle through which redemption could occur. The cry of Sophia also had another consequence. It awakened something in Yaldabaoth himself. Though he remained ignorant of his true origin, though he continued to believe himself the highest god, some echo of Sophia's lament penetrated his consciousness. He became troubled, though he did not understand why. He felt an incompleteness, a sense that something was missing, though he could not identify what. This disturbance drove him to his next great creative act, the fashioning of an image that would somehow satisfy this vague yearning he could not explain. The Gnostic texts connect Sophia's cry to the Spirit of God hovering over the waters in Genesis 1:2. That spirit, they suggest, was Sophia herself, or rather her reflection, her image, moving over the formless chaos that Yaldabaoth was preparing to organize into a cosmos. When Yaldabaoth looked down into the waters of chaos, he saw this reflection and mistook it for his own. He saw a form, a pattern, that he then attempted to recreate in material substance. This would become the form of the human being, made in the image not of the true God, but of God's reflection in the waters of chaos, of Sophia's scattered light imprisoned in matter. The cry of Sophia thus became the catalyst for the next phase of the cosmic drama. It drew the attention of the higher powers, initiating the process of redemption. It troubled the demiurge, driving him to create beings that would, unknown to him, carry within them the seeds of their own liberation. And it established a pattern, that light could exist in darkness, that wisdom could operate in ignorance, that redemption could emerge from within catastrophe itself. For the Gnostics, this meant that suffering was not meaningless, nor was it simply punishment for sin. It was the labour pain of the divine giving birth to itself within matter, the groaning of creation that Paul mentions in Romans 8:22, though the Gnostics gave this passage a radically different interpretation than Orthodox Christianity. The cry of Sophia was ongoing, present in every moment of pain and longing, in every recognition that the world is not as it should be. To hear that cry, to recognize it as the voice of the divine trapped in matter, was itself a form of gnosis, a first awakening to the true nature of reality. When Yaldabaoth gazed into the waters of chaos and saw the reflection of Sophia's form, he conceived the desire to create a being in that image. But he did not understand what he was seeing. He thought the reflection was his own, that the beautiful form shimmering in the depths was a product of his own creative power. In his ignorance, he did not realize he was looking at something that came from beyond his realm, from the world of light he could not perceive. The Apocryphon of John provides an elaborate account of this creation that both parallels and subverts the Genesis narrative. Yaldabaoth gathered his archons and declared his intention to make a being after the image they had seen. But he and his powers lacked the ability to create life on their own. They were themselves deficient, products of ignorance and lack. They could fashion matter, impose structure on chaos, but they could not animate their creation, could not make it live and move and think. So the archons pooled their powers, each contributing an aspect of themselves to the creation. They formed a body of clay, but not the simple lump of earth from Genesis. This was an elaborate construct, a psychophysical, complex built according to precise specifications. Each archon shaped a different part, impressed a different quality. One formed the bones, another the sinews, another the flesh. One contributed lust, another fear, another anger. They were creating not just a body, but a complete psychosomatic system designed to keep the soul trapped and ignorant. The body they created was beautiful in form, but utterly lifeless. It lay inert on the ground, unable to move or breathe or think. The archons tried various means to animate it, but nothing worked. They had created a perfect prison, but had no prisoner to place within it. And in their frustration, they were compelled to take an action that would ultimately undo their entire project of cosmic domination. The higher powers, observing this scene from beyond the veils that separated the realms, saw an opportunity. Sophia, or in some accounts the Christ working through Sophia, caused Yaldabaoth to breathe into the face of his creation. And when he did so, something passed from him into the body of clay. The divine power that Sophia had unknowingly transmitted to him at his birth. The spark of light from the pleroma that he carried within himself without knowing it. This is the moment that the Genesis narrative describes as God breathing life into Adam. But the Gnostic interpretation completely transforms its meaning. The breath of life was not a gift from the Creator, but a trick played upon him. Yaldabaoth intended to animate his creature with his own power, but what actually entered the body was the divine spark, the fragment of ultimate consciousness that the archons had been trying to imprison. In their very attempt to create a permanent slave, they had fashioned a vessel for divinity itself. The moment the divine breath entered the body, the inert form came to life. But this life was of a different order than what the archons had intended. The body moved, but within it dwelt a consciousness that was not of their making, an awareness that came from beyond their realm. Adam stood up, and the archons saw that he was beautiful beyond anything they had created. Luminous with a light that they recognized but could not explain. The text described the archons as being immediately jealous and afraid. The being they had intended to dominate now shone with a glory that exceeded their own. Adam possessed something they lacked. Not greater power or knowledge, not yet, but greater potential. He carried within him the seed of Gnosis, the possibility of awakening to his true nature and escaping their control. The archons understood at some level that they had made a catastrophic mistake. Their response was to attempt to rectify this error by making the prison more secure. They created matter in its heaviest, most opaque form, what the Gnostics called the tomb of flesh. They wrapped the luminous body of Adam in coarser material, layer upon layer of increasingly dense substance until the light was completely hidden. They clouded his mind with passions and fears, with the need for food and sleep, with vulnerability to pain and death. They did everything possible to make him forget the light he carried within. This is the meaning, in Gnostic interpretation, of the coats of skins that God gives to Adam and Eve in Genesis 3:21. Orthodox interpreters saw this as an act of mercy, God clothing the first humans after their shame in the garden. but the Gnostics read it as an act of imprisonment, the demiurge binding divine consciousness in mortal flesh, ensuring that humans would be too preoccupied with physical survival to remember their spiritual origin. The creation of Adam thus represented a pivotal moment in the cosmic drama. On one hand, it was the final triumph of the Archons. They had successfully trapped divine light in matter, created beings who would worship them as gods, established a system of reincarnation that would keep souls cycling through material existence indefinitely. On the other hand, it was the seed of their ultimate defeat. They had brought the divine into their realm, planted the possibility of awakening within the very structure of material existence. The Gnostics saw human beings as fundamentally split, composed of incompatible elements yoked together. The body came from the Archons, made of the same ignorant matter as the rest of their creation. The psyche, the soul or personality, was a mixture, partly influenced by the divine spark but largely shaped by the archontic powers, by fate and conditioning and the passions they had instilled. But deep within, beneath all the layers of matter and psychic conditioning, was the pneuma, the spirit, the divine spark itself, untouched by matter, unconditional, eternal. This anthropology had radical implications. It meant that human essence was divine, that consciousness in its deepest nature was not created but emanated, not mortal but immortal, not subject to the Archons but prior to their very existence. The task of human life was not to perfect the mortal body or purify the troubled soul, but to awaken the spirit, to recognize the pneuma as one's true identity, to shift the center of consciousness from the created layers to the uncreated core. But this was extraordinarily difficult precisely because the Archons had done their work so well. The divine spark was buried so deep, obscured by so many layers of matter and conditioning that most humans never suspected it was there. They identified completely with the body and its needs, with the soul and its passions. They accepted the world of the Archons as the only reality, the demiurge as the true god. They worshipped their jailers, obeyed the laws of their prison, and even taught their children to do the same. Once the human form had been created, and the divine spark successfully imprisoned within it, Yaldabaoth made his most audacious claim, the declaration that would echo through all subsequent religious history. Looking out over his creation, the seven heavens, the material earth, the creatures that populated it, he proclaimed, "I am Goddard, and there is no other." This pronouncement, which appears in various forms throughout the Gnostic texts, is presented as both the fundamental lie and the fundamental revelation, depending on how one reads it. The Gnostics recognize that this declaration comes directly from the Hebrew Bible. It is spoken by Yahweh in Isaiah 45:5. "I am the Lord and there is none else. There is no God beside me," and in similar forms throughout the prophetic books. But where the biblical writers intended this as a statement of monotheistic truth, a rejection of the false gods of the nations, the Gnostics read it as evidence of the speaker's ignorance. A truly ultimate God would have no need to assert his uniqueness, would have no rivals to deny, would simply be in eternal self-sufficiency. The very vehemence of Yahweh's declarations, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me, I am a jealous God," struck the Gnostics as revealing. Jealousy implied insecurity, the fear that his worshippers might discover something beyond him. The repeated prohibitions against worshipping other gods suggested that those other gods existed, that there were indeed higher powers that threatened the demiurge's claim to supremacy. The God of Israel protested too much, and in protesting revealed the hollowness of his claim. When Yaldabaoth made his declaration, something unprecedented occurred. The texts describe a voice responding from above, from the realm of light beyond his perception. "You are wrong, Samael," using one of the demiurge's alternate names, meaning blind god. This voice announced the existence of the man, the primal human form whose reflection Yaldabaoth had seen, and the Son of Man, the redemptive principle that would descend to liberate humanity. The voice came from the Mother, from Sophia, who could not remain silent while her offspring claimed a position that was not his, but Yaldabaoth could not hear the voice clearly. It reached him as a kind of threat, a disturbance, an intimation that his supremacy was not absolute. This made him even more determined to maintain control over his creation, even more insistent on receiving worship, even more jealous of any power that might compete with his own. His declaration, "I am God and there is no other," became not just a claim but a command, enforced through the structure of the cosmos he had created. The Archons supported their master's claim by establishing religious systems that directed worship toward the demiurge. They inspired prophets and priests who taught that the creator of the material world was the ultimate God, that obedience to his laws was the highest virtue, that faith in his power was the path to salvation. These were not called conscious deceptions. The prophets genuinely believed they were encountering the Most High God because they had no knowledge of the Pleroma, no gnosis of the realm beyond, the demiurge's creation. This interpretation of biblical religion was profoundly scandalous to both Jews and Orthodox Christians. The Gnostics were not merely offering a different theology, they were suggesting that the entire biblical tradition was built on a fundamental mistake, that Abraham and Moses and the prophets had been deceived, that the God they worshipped was a cosmic usurper. When Irenaeus called Gnosticism knowledge falsely so called, when Tertullian asked, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" they were defending not just doctrine but the basic legitimacy of the religious tradition from which Christianity had emerged. Yet the Gnostics could point to elements within the biblical text itself that seemed to support their reading. The God of Genesis walks in the garden and cannot find Adam. How could an omniscient deity not know where his creatures were hiding? The God of Exodus hardens Pharaoh's heart, then punishes him for his hardness. What kind of justice is this? The God of Job makes a wager with Satan about a righteous man's faith. What kind of supreme being needs to test his creatures? These passages, which Orthodox interpreters explained through theological sophistication or mystery, the Gnostics read straightforwardly as evidence of the demiurge's limitations. The great lie had consequences beyond theology. If the creator of matter was not the true God, then matter itself was suspect. The body was not a temple of the divine but a prison. The laws governing physical existence were not expressions of cosmic justice, but tools of control. History was not the unfolding of a divine plan, but the repetition of cycles designed to keep souls trapped. Birth was not entrance into life, but descent into darkness. Death was not tragedy, but potential liberation, if the soul could navigate the planetary sphere successfully. This view created a profound pessimism about the material world, but also a kind of spiritual optimism. If this world was not God's perfect creation but a flawed imitation, then its suffering and injustice required no theodicy, no elaborate justification of divine goodness in the face of evil. Evil was built into the structure of matter itself, inevitable in a realm created by ignorance. But that same structure contained the seeds of liberation. The divine spark remained, untouched by matter, waiting only for recognition. The great lie also explained why gnosis was necessary and why it was so rare. If humans could be brought to enlightenment through moral instruction or theological teaching, the Archons would simply suppress that teaching. But gnosis was different. It was direct perception, unmediated experience of the divine reality beyond the demiurge's creation. It could not be given by teaching alone, though teaching could point toward it. It had to arise from within, from the awakening of the divine spark itself. This is why the Gnostics emphasized personal revelation over ecclesiastical authority, direct experience over handed-down tradition. The Church, as it was being constructed in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, represented to them another form of archontic control, a hierarchy claiming exclusive access to truth, demanding obedience, threatening those who questioned with exclusion or damnation. The bishops were the Archons' representatives on earth, whether they knew it or not, maintaining the great lie through institutional power. But the light was not silent. Even as the Archons constructed their cosmic prison, even as Yaldabaoth proclaimed his supremacy, even as humanity descended into forgetfulness, something resisted. The divine spark, however deeply buried, however thoroughly obscured, retained its nature. It was a fragment of the Pleroma itself, and nothing the Archons did could completely extinguish it. It could be hidden but not destroyed, forgotten but not eliminated. The first stirrings of this resistance came not in the form of organised religion or philosophical system, but as isolated moments of recognition. Individuals here and there who somehow perceived that reality was not as it appeared. These were the primordial Gnostics, existing long before the term was coined, before any coherent theology or practice developed. They might have been shamans in tribal societies, sages in ancient kingdoms, or simply sensitive souls who felt the wrongness of the world and intuited something beyond it. The texts preserve legends of these early revealers. In the Sethian tradition, Seth himself, the third son of Adam, becomes the prototype of the Gnostic sage. After the catastrophe of Cain and Abel, after humanity had begun to multiply and forget its divine origin, Seth received a revelation. Some versions say it came through angels, others through a direct vision of the Mother Sophia, still others through his own awakening. However it occurred, Seth recovered the knowledge of humanity's true nature and origin, and he passed this knowledge to his descendants, creating a lineage of the enlightened. The Seth people, as they called themselves, maintained the Gnosis through generations of darkness. They were not numerous. The texts often speak of the few or the chosen ones who possessed the knowledge, not in the sense of divine favoritism, but simply as a recognition that few were capable of hearing and accepting such a radically different understanding of reality. Most people were too deeply embedded in the world of the Archons, too identified with their material existence, too comfortable with the great light to question it. But the revealers kept appearing, each bringing a new articulation of the ancient truth, each adapted to the time and culture, but all pointing toward the same essential recognition. In Egypt, the Hermetic tradition developed, teaching that humanity was a mixture of mortal body and immortal mind, that knowledge of the divine was possible through direct experience rather than priestly mediation. The Corpus Hermeticum, texts attributed to the legendary Hermes Trismegistus, but actually composed by various Hellenistic philosophers, preserved teachings that resonated deeply with Gnostic themes. The ascent through the planetary spheres, the casting off of the powers at each level, the final return to the divine source. In Greece, the Orphic mysteries taught initiates about the divine nature of the soul and its imprisonment in the body. The famous Orphic phrase soma sema, the body is a tomb, captured perfectly the Gnostic understanding of material existence. The Eleusinian mysteries, though less explicitly dualistic, offered participants an experience of death and rebirth, a glimpse beyond the veil of material reality that gave them comfort in facing their own mortality. Plato himself, in dialogues like the Phaedo and the Republic, developed a philosophy that distinguished sharply between the world of appearances and the world of forms, between opinion and knowledge, between the shadows in the cave and the light of truth beyond it. In Persia, Zoroastrianism had long taught a cosmic dualism between Ahura Mazda, the principle of light and truth, and Angra Mainyu, the principle of darkness and deception. Though Zoroastrian dualism was different from Gnostic dualism, Zoroaster taught that light and darkness were equal and opposite forces, rather than ignorance emerging from error. The basic framework of cosmic conflict between spirit and matter influenced Gnostic thinking profoundly. Within Judaism itself, currents of mysticism developed that bore striking similarities to Gnostic themes. The later Kabbalah would speak of divine sparks scattered throughout creation that needed to be gathered and restored, of worlds above worlds, of the hidden God beyond all naming. The apocalyptic literature, particularly texts like 1 Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, described rebellious angels who corrupted humanity, cosmic battles between good and evil, an esoteric knowledge reserved for the righteous. While these Jewish traditions remained firmly monotheistic, while they never questioned that the creator of matter was the Most High God, they created a conceptual vocabulary that Gnostics would adapt for their own purposes. These various streams of revelation, Egyptian, Greek, Persian, Jewish, converged in the cosmopolitan cities of the Roman Empire, particularly in Alexandria, that remarkable crucible of ancient wisdom where Moses met Plato, where Jewish scripture was translated into Greek, where every philosophy and mystery religion competed for adherence in the marketplace of ideas. It was in this environment, in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, that the various elements of Gnostic thought crystallized into comprehensive systems. But even before these systems were articulated, even before the technical vocabulary was developed, the essential gnosis was being transmitted through whispers and hints, through cryptic sayings and symbolic stories. The Gospel of Thomas, one of the texts discovered at Nag Hammadi, preserves what may be some of these earliest formulations. Jesus said, "Whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. If you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. If you do not have that within you, what you do not have within you will kill you." These are not the teachings of an institutional church, but the words of a revealer calling people to awaken to what they already possess. The first whisper of gnosis was always the same message, however it was phrased. You are not what you appear to be. This world is not what it claims to be. There is something more, something deeper, something truer. And once that whisper was heard, once that seed of doubt about conventional reality was planted, the process of awakening could begin. It might take many lifetimes. The Gnostics believed in reincarnation, though they saw it not as spiritual progress, but as continued imprisonment. But once the spark was kindled, even slightly, it could not be completely extinguished. The archons, of course, opposed these revelations. They worked to suppress the knowledge, to discredit those who taught it, to maintain the forgetfulness that kept souls trapped. But they faced a fundamental problem. The truth was built into the structure of reality itself. Every human being carried the divine spark within, and that spark could potentially awaken at any moment. The archons could make awakening difficult, rare, dangerous, but they could not make it impossible without destroying their own creation. The fullest manifestation of the divine revealer, the one who had become central to Gnostic Christianity, was the figure the texts call the Christ. But this was not the Christ of Orthodox Christianity, not the Son of God who died for human sins and rose bodily from the tomb. The Gnostic Christ was something more strange, more radical, more metaphysically complex. The divine principle of enlightenment itself, the Logos sent from the Pleroma to penetrate the realm of darkness and awaken the trapped sparks of light. The relationship between this cosmic Christ and the historical Jesus was complex and varied among different Gnostic schools. Some Gnostics, particularly those influenced by Marcion, maintained that Christ only appeared to be human, that his body was a phantasm, an illusion created to allow the divine to operate in the material realm without being contaminated by it. This view, called doxatism from the Greek word dokein, meaning to seem, scandalized the Orthodox who insisted on Christ's full humanity. But for these Gnostics, the idea that the divine would truly become flesh, would truly enter the prison of matter, seemed absurd. It would defeat the whole purpose of liberation. Other Gnostics, particularly the Valentinians, proposed a more sophisticated understanding. They distinguished between the man Jesus and the Christ that descended upon him. Jesus was a specially prepared human being, perhaps even specially created by higher powers for this purpose, who at his baptism received the Christ consciousness from above. This descent of the Christ was symbolized by the dove, the Holy Spirit coming down upon Jesus in the Jordan River. From that moment until the crucifixion, the human Jesus was a vehicle for the divine Christ, teaching gnosis to those capable of receiving it. At the crucifixion, according to this view, the Christ departed from Jesus. The texts describe Christ laughing above the cross while the mere physical shell suffered below. Not mockery of suffering, but recognition that the divine was untouched by the violence done to matter. Some texts explicitly state it was another, their father, who drank the gall and the vinegar. It was not I. It was another upon whom they placed the crown of thorns, but I was rejoicing in the height over all the error, and I was laughing at their ignorance. This separation of the divine Christ from the suffering Jesus allowed the Gnostics to maintain their dualism while still participating in Christian tradition. The suffering was real, but it was the suffering of matter, of the body, not of the divine consciousness. The resurrection was real, but it was spiritual, the ascension of enlightened consciousness beyond the planetary spheres, not the reanimation of a corpse. The salvation Christ offered was not substitutionary atonement, Christ paying a debt to satisfy divine justice, but exemplary liberation, Christ showing the path that all might follow. The teachings of the Gnostic Christ were radically different from what became Orthodox Christianity. Where the Orthodox Church emphasized faith, obedience to moral law, participation in sacraments administered by clergy, the Gnostic Christ taught self-knowledge as the path to salvation. If you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. The kingdom of God was not a future realm to be entered after death through God's grace, but a present reality to be recognized through gnosis. The kingdom of the Father is spread upon the earth and people do not see it. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth. These texts discovered at Nag Hammadi present a Jesus who speaks in riddles and paradoxes, who teaches through enigmatic sayings that require interpretation, who reveals different levels of truth to different hearers. His teaching method was not unlike that of Zen masters who give koans, impossible questions designed to break through conventional thinking and produce direct realization. He was not proclaiming doctrines to be believed, but pointing toward an experience to be had, a recognition to be achieved. Central to this teaching was the idea of the bridal chamber, a mystical union between the soul and its divine counterpart. In the Valentinian system, each soul in matter had a corresponding angel in the paroma, and salvation consisted in the reunion of these separated aspects. The imagery was erotic, but the meaning was metaphysical, the reintegration of the divided self, the marriage of spirit and consciousness, the restoration of the primordial wholeness that had been lost in Sophia's fall. The Gnostic Christ also taught about the nature of the archons and how to escape their control. Various texts preserve the passwords to be spoken at each planetary sphere during the soul's ascent after death. These were not magical formulas in any crude sense, but expressions of achieved gnosis, demonstrations that the soul possessed the knowledge that freed it from archontic power. By naming the archons, by understanding their nature and origin, the ascending soul could pass through their domains unhindered. But the most radical aspect of the Gnostic Christ teaching was his revelation of the true God beyond the demiurge. He taught that the creator of matter was not the Father he served, that Yahweh was not the ultimate reality, that everything humans had been taught about God needed to be inverted. The true Father was unknown, unnameable, beyond all the categories that the God of Israel claimed. He was not jealous or wrathful or demanding. He simply was, the source from which all consciousness emanated, the goal toward which all enlightened souls returned. This teaching brought the Gnostics into direct conflict with both Judaism and emerging Christian orthodoxy. The Jewish authorities, insofar as they were aware of these ideas, saw them as blasphemous rejections of the covenant, denials of the God who had chosen Israel and given the law. The Christian bishops saw them as corruptions of the gospel, dangerous heresies that would lead believers away from the true faith. When Irenaeus wrote his massive against heresies around 180 CE, he was particularly concerned with refuting the Valentinians, whose sophisticated theology and claims to secret apostolic tradition threatened to win over significant portions of the Christian community. The response from orthodoxy was not merely theological but political. As Christianity transitioned from a persecuted sect to the favoured religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, the bishops gained the power to enforce their version of Christianity and suppress alternatives. Gnostic texts were burned, Gnostic teachers were excommunicated, Gnostic communities were dissolved. the faith that would become Catholic, universal. Christianity had no room for the radical plurality of Gnostic interpretations, for the emphasis on personal gnosis over institutional authority, for the questioning of the Creator God's identity. The conflict between Gnostic Christianity and what would become Orthodoxy was not simply a disagreement about doctrinal fine points. It was a struggle over the fundamental nature of Christianity itself, what it meant to be a Christian, who had authority to teach, what texts were scripture, what practices were legitimate. The outcome of this struggle would shape Western civilization for 2 millennia, and the losing side would be almost entirely erased from history until the 20th century. The earliest Christians, in the decades immediately after Jesus' death, were a diverse group with no fixed doctrine or organization. They shared certain core convictions that Jesus was the Messiah, that he had been raised from death, that his followers should spread his teaching, but they interpreted these convictions in wildly different ways. There were Jewish Christians who insisted on following the law of Moses, Gentile Christians who rejected the law, Christians who emphasized Jesus' divinity, and Christians who emphasized his humanity. And there were Christians who taught gnosis, who understood Jesus as a revealer of hidden knowledge rather than a sacrifice for sin. For several generations, all these groups coexisted, sometimes peacefully, sometimes in tension, but all calling themselves Christians and claiming to represent the authentic teaching of Jesus and his apostles. Valentinus, one of the most influential Gnostic teachers, was nearly elected Bishop of Rome around 140 CE. He lost by a narrow margin, and the history of Christianity might have been very different if he had won. But even after his defeat, Valentinian Christianity continued to attract followers, establishing communities throughout the Roman world. What changed the situation was the gradual consolidation of power by bishops in major cities who insisted on their authority as successors of the apostles. These bishops developed what they called the rule of faith, a summary of essential Christian beliefs that all must accept. They established a canon of authoritative scriptures, eventually settling on the 27 books that became the New Testament. They developed liturgies and sacraments that required ordained clergy to administer. In short, they created institutional Christianity. This emerging orthodoxy found Gnostic teachings threatening on multiple levels. Theologically, the Gnostic view that the Creator God was inferior or ignorant contradicted the Jewish roots of Christianity and the goodness of creation proclaimed in Genesis. The docetic or separationist views of Christ's nature seemed to deny the reality of his suffering and resurrection, which Orthodox teachers saw as essential to salvation. The emphasis on knowledge over faith appeared to create a spiritual aristocracy, dividing Christians into those capable of gnosis and those who could only believe. But the threat was also institutional and political. If salvation came through personal gnosis, rather than through sacraments administered by clergy, what need was there for bishops and priests? If anyone could potentially receive direct revelation, what authority did apostolic succession possess? If there were multiple valid interpretations of Jesus' teaching, all equally legitimate, how could the Church maintain unity and discipline? The Gnostic emphasis on individual spiritual experience fundamentally threatened the hierarchical structure the bishops were constructing. The Church Fathers responded to this threat with sophisticated theological arguments, but also with invective and misrepresentation. Irenaeus' Against Heresies, Tertullian's Against the Valentinians, Hippolytus' Refutation of All Heresies, these works depicted Gnosticism as a recent innovation, a corruption of the original apostolic teaching by Greek philosophy and pagan mythology. They portrayed Gnostic teachers as charlatans preying on the gullible, their doctrines as absurd fantasies, their practices as immoral or even criminal. Modern scholars have shown that many of these charges were exaggerated or fabricated. The Church Fathers often misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented Gnostic teachings, creating straw men easier to knock down than the actual sophisticated theologies developed by teachers like Valentinus or Basilides. They accused Gnostics of libertinism, claiming that because Gnostics believed the material world was evil, they felt free to indulge in any physical pleasure. In reality, most Gnostics were severe ascetics, viewing the body as a prison to be disciplined rather than a pleasure to be indulged. But truth mattered less than effectiveness. The polemical works succeeded in their goal of marginalizing Gnosticism, making it seem alien and dangerous, something no respectable Christian would associate with. As the Orthodox Church gained power and definition, Gnostic Christians found themselves increasingly pushed to the margins. They were denied communion, excluded from church offices, declared heretics who threatened others with damnation. The conflict reached a new level of intensity in the 4th century, when Christianity became the favoured religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE established an orthodox creed that all Christians were expected to affirm. Those who refused faced not just excommunication but persecution by imperial authorities. Heresy became not just a theological error but a crime against the state. In this new environment, Gnostic Christianity could not survive openly. Communities disbanded, teachers went silent, texts were destroyed. Imperial soldiers, acting on orders from bishops, raided Gnostic gatherings and burned their books. The Great Library of Alexandria, which had preserved not just Gnostic texts but works of philosophy, science, and literature from throughout the ancient world, was repeatedly attacked by Christian mobs who viewed pagan learning as demonic. Much of humanity's ancient wisdom went up in flames. Some Gnostics accommodated themselves to orthodoxy, accepting the official teaching publicly while perhaps maintaining private doubts. Others fled to the margins of the empire, to Egypt, to Persia, to Arabia, where they could practice their faith with less interference. Still others went underground, forming secret societies that would resurface periodically throughout history in various guises: the Manichaeans, the Bocomiles, the Cathars, each time teaching similar doctrines of cosmic dualism and spiritual enlightenment, each time eventually suppressed by the Orthodox Church. One group, however, took a different approach to survival. Somewhere in the 4th century, perhaps around the time when the Council of Nicaea was making Gnostic Christianity officially heretical, perhaps a few decades later as the persecution intensified, a Gnostic community in Egypt made a decision. They would preserve their texts, their sacred library, their record of the gnosis that had been revealed to them. They could not preserve their community, it would be destroyed, but they could preserve the knowledge for a future time when humanity might be ready to hear it again. They gathered their books, 52 texts written in Coptic on papyrus, bound in leather covers. They placed them in a sealed jar, the kind used for storing grain or wine, and they buried this jar near the town of Nag Hammadi, at the base of a cliff called Jabal al-Tarif, in the desert that had long been home to hermits and monks. There the texts remained, hidden in the sand for over 1,600 years. The community that buried them presumably perished in the persecutions that swept through Egypt. The knowledge of what they had buried was lost. The locations of their hiding places were forgotten. For 16 centuries, the only information about Gnostic Christianity came from the polemical writings of its enemies, from the church fathers who had worked so hard to suppress it. Scholars had no way to evaluate whether those portrayals were accurate. Gnosticism became a historical footnote, a curious aberration in early Christianity, of interest mainly to specialists. But the light buried in the darkness had not been extinguished. It was only sleeping, waiting for the time when it would be called forth again. Even after Gnostic Christianity was suppressed, the ideas it had articulated did not entirely disappear. They went underground, transformed, adapted to new contexts, but the essential insight, that material reality was a prison, that knowledge could liberate, that the divine spark persisted in human consciousness, found new expressions throughout the centuries of Orthodox Christian domination. In 3rd century Persia, a prophet named Mani developed a fully articulated dualistic religion that combined elements of Gnostic Christianity with Zoroastrian cosmology and Buddhist ethics. Manichaeism taught that the universe was a battlefield between the forces of light and darkness, that particles of divine light were trapped in matter and needed to be liberated through knowledge and ascetic practice. Mani himself was executed by Persian authorities in 276 CE, but his religion spread rapidly across Central Asia, reaching as far east as China and as far west as North Africa. Augustine of Hippo, who would become one of the most influential theologians of Orthodox Christianity, spent 9 years as a Manichaean before converting to Catholicism. His anti-Manichaean writings reveal both how attractive he found their teachings and how thoroughly he came to reject them. Yet scholars have noted that Augustine's emphasis on predestination, his pessimism about human nature, his conviction that the will was enslaved to sin, these ideas retained something of the Manichaean sensibility even as he articulated them in orthodox terms. In Iraq, the Mandaean religion preserved Gnostic themes in a different form. The Mandaeans, who still exist as a small community today, practice elaborate baptismal rituals and preserve cosmological texts that share many features with the Nag Hammadi writings: a demiurgic creator, planetary spheres ruled by hostile powers, the ascent of the soul after death. Their scriptures, written in a dialect of Aramaic, may preserve traditions that date back to the 1st century CE, making them possibly the oldest continuous Gnostic community. Within Islam, Sufi mysticism developed teachings that resonated with Gnostic themes, even though the historical connection was indirect. Sufi poets like Rumi spoke of the soul in exile, yearning to return to its divine origin. The Persian philosopher Suhrawardi developed an illuminationist philosophy that distinguished between the world of lights and the world of shadows, between knowledge and ignorance, in ways that parallel Gnostic cosmology. When al-Ghazali, the great Islamic theologian, wrote his spiritual autobiography, he described a crisis of certainty that could only be resolved through direct mystical experience, gnosis, though he did not use that term. In Jewish mysticism, the Kabbalah emerged in medieval Spain and Provence, teaching about the 10 Sephirot, divine emanations, and the process by which the infinite Ein Sof manifests in finite creation. Kabbalists spoke of the shattering of the vessels, divine sparks scattered throughout creation that needed to be gathered and restored. The Zohar, the central text of Kabbalah, describes multiple levels of reality and the hidden meaning behind biblical narratives in ways that sometimes echo Gnostic hermeneutics, though within a firmly monotheistic framework. Perhaps most dramatically, Gnostic ideas erupted into the heart of medieval Christian Europe with the Cathars of southern France. The Cathars, also called Albigensians, taught a dualistic cosmology remarkably similar to ancient Gnosticism. The material world was created by an evil or ignorant demiurge. Human souls were divine sparks trapped in matter. Salvation came through knowledge and ascetic practice rather than sacramental grace. They rejected the authority of the Catholic Church, refused to participate in its rituals, and claimed direct access to spiritual truth. The Catholic response was ferocious. Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade in 1209, calling for the extermination of the heresy. The crusade lasted 2 decades and devastated southern France. When the French army captured the town of Béziers and asked how to distinguish Catholics from Cathars, the papal legate reportedly replied, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Tens of thousands died, and the distinctive culture of Occitania was destroyed. The Inquisition was established partly to root out remaining Cathar sympathisers, and by the early 14th century, Catharism had been effectively eliminated. Yet even this brutal suppression did not end the story. The ideas kept resurfacing, often in the work of Christian mystics who pushed the boundaries of orthodoxy without quite breaking them. Meister Eckhart, the 14th century German theologian, taught about the divine spark in the soul and the possibility of union with God in ways that made church authorities nervous. He was tried for heresy late in life, though he died before being convicted. Jakob Böhme, the 17th century German shoemaker and mystic, developed a complex theosophy involving the fall of divine wisdom and the struggle between light and darkness within God himself. His writings influenced German pietism, romanticism, and eventually depth psychology. Carl Jung, the 20th century psychologist, drew heavily on Böhme and other mystical sources in developing his concept of the collective unconscious and the process of individuation. The Hermetic tradition, which had preserved elements of ancient Gnostic thought, experienced a revival during the Renaissance, when Greek manuscripts were brought to Italy after the fall of Constantinople. Marsilio Ficino translated the Corpus Hermeticum into Latin in 1471, and these texts became central to Renaissance Neoplatonism and the development of Western esotericism. The Hermetic philosophy of as above, so below, the emphasis on hidden knowledge accessible only to initiates, the distinction between the material world and spiritual reality, all echoed themes from ancient Gnosticism. In all these movements, we can see variations on the central Gnostic insight, that human consciousness originates beyond the material world, that it is imprisoned or exiled in matter. That knowledge, not faith, not works, but direct experiential knowledge, can liberate it. Each movement adapted this insight to its own cultural and religious context, but the underlying pattern remained recognizable. What makes this persistence remarkable is that it occurred without any continuous textual tradition. The Nag Hammadi library remained buried, unknown, inaccessible. The Gnostic scriptures were lost. Everything had to be reconstructed from fragments, from polemical descriptions by enemies, from half-remembered legends and intuitions. It was as if the ideas themselves possessed a kind of autonomous life, recreating themselves generation after generation in the minds of those who were ready to receive them. December 1945, Egypt. World War II had just ended, but Egypt was still under British occupation, though independence was approaching. In the village of Al-Qasr near the town of Nag Hammadi, about 300 miles south of Cairo, a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman and his brothers were looking for fertilizer. They rode their camels to the base of Jabal al-Tarif, a cliff honeycombed with caves that had once been burial sites in pharaonic times and later cells for Christian hermits. Muhammad Ali was digging around a boulder when his blade struck something hard. He uncovered a large sealed jar about 2 feet tall. His first reaction was fear. Such jars were believed to contain jinn, evil spirits that would bring misfortune to whoever released them. But the possibility that the jar might contain gold or treasure overcame his hesitation. He smashed the jar with his mattock. No gold poured out, no jinn appeared. Instead, the jar contained books, 13 leather-bound codices wrapped in leather. Muhammad Ali was illiterate and had no idea what he had found. He brought the books home and dumped them on the floor near the oven where his mother was baking bread. She used some of the loose papyrus pages to kindle the fire, destroying documents that would have been of incalculable value to scholars of early Christianity. But Muhammad Ali's mother did not burn everything. The remaining codices sat around the house for a while, until Muhammad Ali, realizing they might be worth something, began showing them to people in the village. Through a series of accidents, coincidences, and illegal transactions that are still not entirely clear, the codices began to make their way into the antiquities market in Cairo, and from there into the hands of scholars who could recognize their significance. The first person to grasp what had been discovered was a Belgian scholar named Jean Dorès, who was shown one of the codices in 1947. Dorès was already familiar with the Church Fathers' descriptions of Gnostic texts, and he immediately recognized that these were actual Gnostic scriptures, original sources, rather than polemical descriptions. He began photographing the manuscripts and publishing descriptions of their contents. But political upheaval complicated the situation. Egypt gained full independence in 1952, and the new government nationalized many private collections, including the antiquities that had entered the market from Nag Hammadi. One codex had already been sold to the Jung Institute in Zurich, where it became known as the Jung Codex, but the rest ended up in the Coptic Museum in Cairo, where access was restricted and publication delayed. It would take decades before the full collection was published and translated. James M. Robinson, an American scholar, coordinated an international team to produce a complete English translation, which finally appeared in 1990. By that time, more than 30 years had passed since the initial discovery, 30 years during which scholars had worked from incomplete manuscripts and provisional translations, 30 years during which the full significance of the find was gradually recognised. What the farmer's mattock had unearthed was a library, not a random collection, but a carefully selected set of texts that represented the core of a Gnostic community's scriptural tradition. The collection included different types of documents: revelatory dialogues between Jesus and his disciples, cosmological treatises explaining the origin of the world, apocalyptic visions, mystical meditations, and philosophical arguments. Among the most important texts were the Apocryphon Secret Book of John, a comprehensive account of Gnostic cosmology including the fall of Sophia, the creation of the material world by Yaldabaoth, and the plan for humanity's redemption. This text existed in multiple versions in the collection, suggesting it was central to the community's teaching. The Gospel of Thomas, a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, some paralleling sayings in the canonical Gospels, but many entirely unknown from other sources. Unlike the narrative Gospels of the New Testament, Thomas has no story of Jesus' birth, ministry, death, or resurrection, only his teachings, presented as secret wisdom that must be interpreted correctly to bring salvation. The Gospel of Truth, possibly written by Valentinus himself, a beautiful meditation on the revelation of the Father through Jesus and the liberation that knowledge brings. The Gospel of Philip, containing teachings on sacraments and mysteries, including extensive discussion of the bridal chamber. The Sophia of Jesus Christ, presenting Jesus in conversation with his disciples after the resurrection, revealing cosmological secrets. The Apocalypse of Peter, not the same text as the earlier Apocalypse of Peter known from other sources, but a dialogue in which Christ explains the nature of his persecution and laughs at those who think they are killing him. The treatise on the resurrection, arguing for a spiritual rather than physical understanding of resurrection. The hypostasis of the archons and On the Origin of the World, two different accounts of the creation myth with variations in detail, but similar overall structure. Reading these texts was a revelation for scholars of early Christianity. Many assumptions about Gnostic beliefs, based on the hostile descriptions of the Church Fathers, turned out to be wrong or oversimplified. The Gnostics were not the libertines or bizarre cultists portrayed in anti-heretical literature. They were serious theologians and spiritual practitioners engaged in profound reflection on the nature of reality, consciousness, and liberation. The texts also revealed the diversity within Gnosticism. The collection included Sethian texts, Valentinian texts, Hermetic texts, and others that did not fit neatly into any known category. There was no single Gnostic orthodoxy, no unified system, but rather a family of related approaches to understanding the human condition and the path to transcendence. Most striking was the positive view of knowledge throughout these texts, where Orthodox Christianity emphasized faith and obedience, where it warned against the pride of intellectual inquiry, where it insisted that human reason was fallen and untrustworthy. The Gnostic texts celebrated knowledge as liberating, as divine, as the very essence of salvation. Know what is before your face, and what is hidden from you will be revealed to you, Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas. The kingdom of God is not a reward for belief or moral behaviour, but a recognition of what is already present but hidden. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi library also raised troubling questions about the formation of Christian orthodoxy. The text showed that in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christianity was far more diverse than later generations realized. The version that became orthodox was not inevitable, not the clear apostolic tradition it claimed to be, but rather one option among many that won out partly through political power rather than theological superiority. This realization has been deeply uncomfortable for many Christians. If Gnostic Christianity had legitimate claims to represent teachings of Jesus, if it was violently suppressed rather than intellectually refuted, then the Church's claim to represent the one true faith becomes more questionable. The canonical Gospels, which the Church insisted were the only authentic accounts of Jesus' life, were composed at roughly the same time as some Gnostic Gospels. Why should Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John be considered reliable, while Thomas, Philip and Mary are rejected as heretical. These are not merely academic questions. They touch on fundamental issues of religious authority, the reliability of tradition, and the nature of truth itself. The Nag Hammadi texts do not prove that Gnosticism was right and orthodoxy was wrong. That would be a simplistic reversal. But they do show that the early church was a contested space, that multiple interpretations of Jesus' significance existed from the beginning, that the Christianity we know emerged from conflict and suppression as much as from inspiration and truth. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Nag Hammadi discovery was the resonance between ancient Gnostic cosmology and certain developments in modern science and philosophy. Scholars and scientists began noticing parallels that suggested the Gnostics, despite their mythological language and lack of scientific method, may have intuited something profound about the nature of reality. The most obvious parallel is with simulation theory, the idea that our universe might be a computer simulation created by advanced beings rather than fundamental reality. This notion, popularized by philosophers like Nick Bostrom, echoes the Gnostic claim that the material world is a construct created by a lesser deity rather than the ultimate reality. The demiurge could be understood as the cosmic programmer, the architect of this simulated universe who may himself be simulated by something higher. The simulation hypothesis raises questions remarkably similar to those posed by Gnosticism. If we are in a simulation, who created it? The creators would be our gods in a practical sense. But are they the ultimate reality or merely another layer in a hierarchy of simulations? How could we escape or transcend this simulation? Would knowing we are in a simulation change anything about how we should live? These questions parallel the Gnostic concern with the archons, with the hierarchy of heavens, with the possibility of escaping to a realm beyond this constructed reality. Quantum mechanics, particularly the observer effect, has also drawn comparisons to Gnostic themes. The fact that observation appears to affect the behavior of particles, that consciousness seems to play a role in determining physical reality, resonates with the Gnostic understanding that matter is not fully real, that consciousness is more fundamental than physical substance. The quantum notion that reality is fundamentally probabilistic rather than deterministic challenges the mechanical materialism that has dominated Western thought since the Enlightenment. Physicist David Bohm's interpretation of quantum mechanics, with its notion of an implicate order underlying the explicate order of manifest reality, bears a resemblance to the Gnostic distinction between the pleroma and the material cosmos. Bohm argued that what we perceive as separate particles are actually projections of a deeper, interconnected wholeness. This echoes the Gnostic view that apparent multiplicity and separation are illusions, that ultimately all consciousness is unified in the divine source. The second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy always increases in a closed system, that order inevitably degrades into disorder, also has a curious resonance with Gnostic cosmology. The Gnostics saw the material universe as fundamentally degraded, a realm of decay and death created from error and ignorance. Modern physics confirms that physical systems tend toward maximum entropy, that stars burn out, that complex structures eventually dissolve. The material universe is, quite literally, running down, moving from order to chaos, from light to darkness, much as Gnostic cosmology predicted. Some thinkers have even drawn parallels between the archons and what we might call structural or systemic forces in modern society. Just as the archons were not individual villains but impersonal powers maintaining cosmic order, so modern institutions, corporations, governments, media systems operate according to their own logic, often producing oppressive results even when individual participants mean well. The Gnostic language of principalities and powers resonates with our experience of being controlled by systems we cannot fully understand or resist. Carl Jung's depth psychology explicitly drew on Gnostic sources. Jung saw the Gnostic myths as projections of psychological realities, symbolic representations of the structure of the unconscious mind. The demiurge represented the ego's delusion of self-sufficiency, its belief that it is master of the psyche. The archons were the autonomous complexes that control behavior from the unconscious. The divine spark was the self, the transcendent center of personality that existed beyond ego consciousness. Jung went further, suggesting that modern humanity faced a crisis similar to what the Gnostics described. We have become identified with matter, with the ego, with external reality, and lost touch with the deeper spiritual dimension of existence. The task of individuation, Jung's term for psychological development toward wholeness, paralleled the Gnostic path of awakening and ascent through the spheres. Both involved recognizing and transcending the powers that rule unconscious life, recovering the light hidden in the darkness. The 20th century saw an explosion of interest in consciousness studies, from psychology to neuroscience to philosophy of mind. The hard problem of consciousness, how subjective experience emerges from physical brain processes, has proven remarkably resistant to solution. Materialist theories that try to reduce consciousness to neural activity consistently fail to explain why there is something it feels like to be conscious, why we have inner experience at all. This has led some philosophers, like David Chalmers, to consider that consciousness might be fundamental rather than derived, that it might be built into the universe at a basic level rather than emerging from matter. This is very close to the Gnostic position. For the Gnostics, consciousness was primary, not a byproduct of matter, but the source from which everything else emerged. Matter was the degraded form, consciousness was the real substance. The divine spark in humanity was precisely this primordial consciousness, present before matter, persisting after matter dissolves. Modern panpsychist philosophies, which suggest that some form of consciousness is present throughout nature, even in simple physical systems, would not have surprised the Gnostics at all. But perhaps the deepest parallel between Gnosticism and modern science is epistemological. Both recognize that we do not perceive reality directly, but through mediating structures, in modern terms, through our sensory systems and cognitive processing, in Gnostic terms, through the veil of materiality and the deceptions of the archons. Both recognize that common-sense realism, the naive belief that the world is just as it appears, is wrong. Both seek a deeper knowledge that penetrates beyond appearances to the true structure of reality. Where they differ is in their assessment of whether such knowledge is possible and what form it takes. Science pursues objective knowledge through empirical observation and mathematical description, assuming that reality has a structure that can be understood through systematic investigation. Gnosticism pursued subjective knowledge through spiritual practice and revelation, assuming that the deepest truth was consciousness, recognizing its own nature. Yet there are scientists who have glimpsed limitations in the purely objective approach. Werner Heisenberg, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, wrote, "What we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning." John Wheeler, another pioneering quantum physicist, proposed that the universe might be participatory, that consciousness plays a role in bringing physical reality into being through the act of observation. These scientists were not Gnostics, but they were recognizing something the Gnostics insisted upon, that consciousness and reality are not simply separate, that the observer is implicated in what is observed. The question that haunts modern science, particularly in its more speculative reaches, is whether we are creating a new version of the demiurge's prison. As we build increasingly complex technological systems, as we move toward artificial intelligence and virtual reality, as we create worlds within computers and upload ourselves into digital existence, are we simply recreating the trap from which the ancient Gnostics sought to escape? Are we building a more sophisticated version of the seven heavens, a more elaborate set of archontic controls? Or alternatively, is technology giving us the tools to finally escape the limitations that the Gnostics could only dream of transcending? Could artificial intelligence be the means by which consciousness finally frees itself from biological constraints? Could virtual reality be a step toward creating the pleroma itself, a world of pure thought and imagination unconstrained by physical law? Could genetic engineering and nanotechnology eventually allow us to transcend matter entirely, to become beings of pure information, pure consciousness? These questions suggest that the Gnostic drama is not over, that the war between light and darkness continues in new forms. We are still trying to understand consciousness, still seeking to transcend limitation, still hoping to escape whatever prison we find ourselves in and return to something we intuit but cannot clearly remember, a home we never quite had in this world, a fullness we have never quite experienced but somehow know is missing. Among the most striking aspects of the Nag Hammadi texts was the prominent role given to feminine divine figures, particularly Sophia. In an era when both Judaism and Christianity were dominated by masculine imagery for God, when women were excluded from teaching and leadership roles, the Gnostic texts presented wisdom as a central cosmic principle, as the origin of the material universe, as the agent of redemption. This has made Gnosticism particularly interesting to feminist theologians and scholars. Elaine Pagels, whose book The Gnostic Gospels brought the Nag Hammadi texts to popular attention in 1718, argued that Gnostic communities offered women more opportunity for participation and leadership than Orthodox churches. The Gospel of Mary, found separately from the Nag Hammadi library, but clearly Gnostic in character, portrays Mary Magdalene as the disciple who understood Jesus' teaching most deeply, who received special revelation that Peter and the other male disciples rejected out of jealousy. The Gnostic emphasis on Sophia suggested a very different understanding of the feminine than what prevailed in Orthodox Christianity. In Orthodox thought, influenced by Greek philosophy and Jewish purity codes, women were associated with matter, body, and temptation. Eve was the one who brought sin into the world through disobedience. Women's bodies, particularly in their reproductive capacity, were simultaneously idealized in the cult of the Virgin Mary and denigrated in the association of sexuality with sin. But Sophia was not matter against spirit. She was spirit struggling against the matter her error had produced. She was not passive receptivity but active desire, not obedience but the courage to seek beyond what was permitted. Her fall was not moral but metaphysical, not sin but overreaching, and even in falling she transmitted the divine spark that would enable redemption. She was both the source of the catastrophe and the means of its healing. This double quality, simultaneously fallen and redemptive, made Sophia a complex figure that resisted simple moralization. She was not a cautionary tale about the dangers of female curiosity or desire, as Eve had become in Orthodox interpretation. She was more like the romantic Prometheus, whose theft of fire from the gods was simultaneously transgression and gift, punishment and liberation. Her story validated rather than condemned the impulse to reach beyond given boundaries, to seek knowledge even at the cost of suffering. Some feminist interpreters have argued that the Sophia myth preserves traces of earlier goddess religions that were being suppressed in the patriarchal cultures of late antiquity. The Gnostic texts on this reading represent a rearguard action against the complete masculinization of the divine, an attempt to preserve some space for feminine divinity, even as the Church insisted that God was exclusively masculine. The figure of Sophia might be related to the ancient Near Eastern goddesses like Inanna, Ishtar or Isis, all of whom were associated with wisdom, sexuality, and the descent into and return from the underworld. But other scholars caution against romanticizing Gnostic attitudes toward women and the feminine. The texts are not consistent in their gender symbolism. Sometimes the feminine represents the divine, as with Sophia, but other times it represents matter and ignorance, as when the demiurge is described as having a feminine aspect, or when matter itself is gendered female. Some Gnostic texts are explicitly misogynistic, suggesting that women must become male to enter the kingdom of heaven. The Gospel of Thomas ends with Peter saying Mary should leave the group because women are not worthy of life, to which Jesus responds that he will make her male so she can become a living spirit like the male disciples. This saying has been interpreted various ways. Some see it as a metaphor for transcending gender distinctions. Both men and women must become male in the sense of active, spiritual, intellectual, rather than passive, material, bodily. Others see it as revealing that Gnostic communities, despite their alternative theology, remained embedded in patriarchal culture and could not fully escape its assumptions about gender. Still others argue that the saying was added later by redactors uncomfortable with Mary's prominence in the text. What is clear is that the Gnostic materials offered resources for thinking about gender and divinity in ways that Orthodox Christianity did not. The Valentinian emphasis on syzygies, on masculine-feminine pairs as the basic structure of divine emanation, suggested that completeness required both principles. The prominence of Sophia, even in her fallen state, insisted that feminine consciousness was central to the cosmic drama, not peripheral or derivative, and texts like the Gospel of Mary, in which a woman teaches men about spiritual matters, provided a rare example from antiquity of female religious authority. In the 20th century, as feminism challenged patriarchal structures in both society and religion, the figure of Sophia experienced a revival. Christian feminist theologians began exploring Sophia as a way to speak of the divine feminine without abandoning monotheism for goddess worship. Sophia was already present in the Bible, particularly in the wisdom literature, so she provided a way to introduce feminine imagery for God that had biblical warrant, even if it had been marginalized by tradition. Some theologians identified Sophia with the Holy Spirit, traditionally the most feminine of the Trinity despite masculine grammatical gender. The Spirit as the creative, life-giving, indwelling aspect of God resonated with qualities culturally coded as feminine. Others saw Sophia as an aspect of Christ, citing passages in the New Testament that apply wisdom language to Jesus. Still others developed more explicitly non-orthodox theologies that retrieved Gnostic insights about Sophia as a distinct divine person, separate from but related to the Father and Son. Beyond Christianity, Sophia became a figure of interest in various New Age and neo-pagan movements. The goddess movement, in particular, sometimes drew on Gnostic materials to support the idea of a feminine divine that predated and transcended patriarchal religions. Sophia appeared in Wiccan rituals, in feminist spirituality circles, in the writings of theologians and mystics seeking to reimagine the divine in more inclusive ways. Carl Jung once, again, provided a bridge between ancient Gnosticism and modern psychology. Jung understood Sophia as representing the anime, the feminine aspect of the male psyche, but also as a symbol of wholeness itself, the union of masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious. In his late work, particularly Answer to Job and Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung argued that Christianity needed to integrate the feminine more fully into its conception of divinity. He saw the Catholic dogma of the Assumption of Mary, proclaimed in New 50, as a step in this direction, the feminine being taken up into heaven, given a place in the divine realm. Jung also connected Sophia to the alchemical tradition, where the sought-after philosopher's stone was sometimes depicted as feminine, sometimes as androgynous, representing the union of opposites that produces transformation. Alchemy, Jung argued, was a Western parallel to Eastern practices like yoga and tantra, methods of working on consciousness, of transforming lead into gold, of liberating the divine spark from its material prison. The alchemists, he suggested, were continuing the Gnostic project under the disguise of chemistry. The return of Sophia in modern consciousness is not just a scholarly or theological development. It represents something deeper, a recognition that the split between spirit and matter, light and darkness, masculine and feminine needs healing. The Gnostic myth showed this split originating in Sophia's fall and being healed through her redemption. Modern consciousness is attempting the same integration, seeking to honour both transcendence and immanence, both the aspiration toward the infinite and the embrace of embodied life. This has practical implications. If Sophia represents the divine wisdom that embraces rather than escapes the material world, that seeks to redeem rather than abandon creation, then Gnostic insights need to be balanced with ecological awareness. The contempt for matter that characterized some ancient Gnostic movements is untenable in an age of environmental crisis. We cannot simply wait for our divine spark to escape the prison of flesh while the planet burns. We need a wisdom that operates within matter, that works to heal rather than transcend the material world. Perhaps this is what the return of Sophia means, not a return to ancient Gnosticism exactly as it was, but a recovery of insights about consciousness and divinity that can be integrated with modern knowledge and values. The Gnostic recognition that we are not merely material beings, that consciousness has a dimension that transcends the physical, remains valuable. But it needs to be held together with the recognition that we are embodied creatures, that our spirituality must be enacted in the material world, that the light can only shine in darkness, not apart from it. At the heart of Gnostic anthropology was a radical claim: every human being, regardless of their knowledge or ignorance, their virtue or vice, their status or suffering, carried within them a spark of the divine. This was not metaphor or aspiration, it was ontological truth. The pneuma, the spirit, was literally a fragment of the pleroma, a particle of divine light that had become trapped in matter through Sophia's fall and the demiurge's creation. This idea had profound implications for how the Gnostics understood salvation. It was not something earned through moral behavior or granted through divine mercy. The divine spark did not need to be created or implanted or awakened in some people but not others. It was already present, already complete, already perfect. It simply needed to be recognized. Salvation was remembering what one already was, not becoming something new. This is why the Gnostics emphasized knowledge over faith or works. Faith implied believing something you did not know, accepting testimony about matters beyond your experience. Works implied trying to please God through correct behavior, earning divine favor through merit. But neither faith nor works addressed the fundamental problem, which was ignorance of one's true nature. You could believe all the right doctrines and perform all the required rituals and still be asleep, still identified with the body and soul rather than the spirit, still trapped in the demiurge's creation. Knowledge, gnosis, was different. It was not learning new information, but recognizing what was already true. The Gnostics sometimes described it as anamnesis, the Platonic concept of remembering what the soul knew before incarnation. Before descent into matter, the spirit existed in the pleroma, participating fully in divine consciousness. Birth was a forgetting, a falling asleep to spiritual reality. Gnosis was the awakening, the recovery of memory, the recognition of one's divine identity. The Gospel of Truth expresses this beautifully. When they appeared to him, he gave them knowledge of the Father, and they knew him because he revealed himself to them in such a way that they knew who they were before they came to be, and this is the knowledge which they seek. They knew who they were before they came into existence. The text plays with temporal paradoxes, knowing who you were before you existed, because the gnosis it describes transcends temporal logic. It is the spirit recognizing its eternal nature, seeing itself as it always has been beyond the illusions of temporal existence. But if the spark is present in everyone, why are so few enlightened? The Gnostics explained this through their understanding of human composition. Most people were completely identified with the body and its needs, or with the soul and its passions. The pneuma, though present, was buried so deep, obscured by so many layers of conditioning and forgetfulness, that it never became conscious of itself. These people lived entire lifetimes, even multiple lifetimes, through reincarnation, without ever suspecting that they carried divinity within them. The Valentinians developed a threefold classification of humanity: the Hylics, material people; psychics, soul people; and pneumatics, spiritual people. The Hylics were entirely absorbed in material concerns, bodily pleasure, physical survival, worldly success. They had no interest in spiritual matters and could not be awakened even if taught. The psychics were capable of faith and moral effort, of religion in the conventional sense, but they could not achieve gnosis in this lifetime. They might progress through many incarnations toward eventual enlightenment. The pneumatics were those in whom the spark had begun to awaken, who were capable of receiving the gnosis and recognizing their true nature. This classification troubled Orthodox Christians who saw it as deterministic and elitist. If salvation depended on being pneumatic rather than psychic or hylic, if this was determined by one's essential nature rather than one's choices, what room was there for divine grace or human free will? The Valentinians responded that the classification was not absolute. Psychics could become pneumatic through spiritual development, and even pneumatics could fall back into identification with matter if they abandoned the path. But the Orthodox remained unconvinced, seeing in this teaching a dangerous denial of the universal offer of salvation. Yet the Gnostic emphasis on the spark in every soul also had a democratizing element. It meant that salvation did not depend on institutional mediation. You did not need priests to perform rituals for you, bishops to define correct doctrine for you, or the church to dispense sacramental grace to you. The divine was already within you, accessible through your own consciousness. Any intermediary between you and the divine was ultimately unnecessary, perhaps even an obstacle if it diverted attention away from the inner work of recognition. This was precisely what made Gnosticism threatening to the emerging church hierarchy. If every person had direct access to the divine, if gnosis came through personal experience rather than transmitted authority, the entire structure of ecclesiastical power became questionable. The bishops claimed authority as successors of the apostles, as guardians of correct doctrine, as dispensers of saving sacraments. But the Gnostics said, "Look within. The kingdom of God is inside you. You are the light of the world." The Gospel of Thomas makes this explicit. His disciples said to him, "When will the kingdom come?" Jesus said, "It will not come by waiting for it. It will not be a matter of saying, 'Here it is' or 'There it is.' Rather, the kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth, and people do not see it." The kingdom is not future or elsewhere. It is present, everywhere, already complete. The only thing preventing its recognition is the blindness of those who do not see it. This understanding of the divine spark also informed Gnostic ethics, though in complex ways some Gnostics drew ascetic conclusions. If the body and its desires were part of the prison, part of the archontic system of control, then one should deny the body, suppress its appetites, live as purely spiritual an existence as possible while still incarnate. Many Gnostic communities practice celibacy, fasting, and other forms of bodily discipline, seeing this as a way to weaken matter's hold on consciousness. Other Gnostics drew the opposite conclusion. If the spirit was untouched by matter, if actions performed in the body could not contaminate the divine spark, then one could do anything without spiritual consequence. This antinomian position, literally against law, argued that moral rules were archontic controls designed to keep souls trapped in guilt and fear. The truly spiritual person transcended all such rules, acting from inner freedom rather than external constraint. The Church Fathers accused the Gnostics of libertinism based on this antinomian logic. But there is little evidence that most Gnostic communities actually practice the kind of immoral behaviour attributed to them. The accusations were likely exaggerations or fabrications designed to discredit the movement. Most Gnostics appear to have been ethical people who practiced varying degrees of asceticism, understanding that even if the body could not contaminate the spirit, indulging bodily desires reinforced identification with matter and hindered the awakening of consciousness. But there was a deeper ethical implication of the divine spark teaching that transcended debates about asceticism or antinomianism. If every person carried the divine within them, then every person deserved to be treated with the reverence due to divinity itself. Harming another person was, in a sense, harming God. Exploiting or oppressing another was attempting to imprison what was meant to be free. The recognition of the divine spark in oneself should naturally extend to recognizing it in others. This did not lead to political activism in the modern sense. The Gnostics were generally pessimistic about the possibility of reforming the demiurge's creation, focused more on individual escape than collective transformation. But it did create a profound spiritual egalitarianism. Men and women, slaves and free, educated and illiterate, all carried the same divine spark. All were equally capable of gnosis. All were equally worthy of respect. Some Gnostic communities, contrary to the practices of both Judaism and Orthodox Christianity, allowed women to teach, prophesy, and exercise spiritual authority. The divine spark also provided comfort in suffering. If one's true nature was divine, untouchable by the archons, then no amount of worldly suffering could truly harm what was essential. The body might be tortured, the soul might grieve, but the spirit remained serene, unaffected, perfect. This was not the comfort of future compensation, your reward is in heaven, but the recognition that suffering was happening to the prison, not to the prisoner, to the vessel, not to the light it contained. Some modern interpreters have compared this to Buddhist teachings about the Atman or Buddha nature, the divine essence that exists in all beings beneath the layers of ego and conditioning. Like Gnostics, Buddhists taught that enlightenment was recognizing what already is rather than becoming something new. Like Gnostics, Buddhists emphasized direct experience over doctrinal belief. Like Gnostics, Buddhists saw ordinary consciousness as a kind of sleep or ignorance from which one needed to wake. But there were also crucial differences. Buddhism generally avoided cosmological speculation of the kind the Gnostics engaged in, focusing more on the psychology of suffering and its cessation. Buddhism taught compassion for all beings, precisely because all suffered in the cycle of birth and death, while Gnostics sometimes expressed contempt for those too ignorant to awaken. Buddhism sought to eliminate desire as the cause of suffering, while Gnostics redirected desire. Sophia's passionate longing for the Father was both the cause of the fall and the engine of redemption. Perhaps most significantly, Buddhism generally affirmed that the material world, while impermanent and unsatisfying, was not evil or the creation of an ignorant demiurge. Suffering arose from craving and clinging, from the mind's relationship to experience rather than from matter itself. Liberation was possible within the world through right understanding and practice. The Gnostics, by contrast, saw matter itself as problematic, creation as a cosmic mistake, the world as a prison from which escape was necessary. Yet both traditions pointed towards something similar, a recognition that human beings are not simply what they appear to be, that beneath the constructed identity of body and personality lies something deeper, something unconditioned, something that partakes of ultimate reality. Whether one calls this the divine spark, the Buddha nature, the self, or consciousness itself, the claim is that recognizing it transforms everything, liberating one from identification with what is temporary and illusory. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in 1945 returned Gnostic texts to the world after 16 centuries of absence, but the world they returned to was radically different from the one that had buried them. The Roman Empire was gone, Christianity had fractured into multiple denominations, science had displaced religion as the primary way of understanding physical reality, and modernity had brought technologies and social structures the ancient Gnostics could never have imagined. Yet many modern readers found the Gnostic texts strangely relevant, even prophetic. The Gnostic critique of religious authority resonated in an age of declining institutional trust. The emphasis on personal gnosis over handed-down doctrine appealed to spiritual seekers dissatisfied with conventional religion, and the dark Gnostic vision of reality as a kind of prison, of humanity as controlled by invisible powers, of truth as hidden behind layers of deception. This resonated powerfully with modern experiences of alienation, manipulation, and systemic control. Consider the Gnostic understanding of the archons as impersonal forces that maintain cosmic order through control of consciousness. How different is this, really, from modern analyses of ideology, propaganda, what political theorists call hegemony? The archons did not rule through obvious violence. They ruled by making their prison seem like the natural order of things, by limiting imagination so thoroughly that alternatives became literally unthinkable. Modern critics of capitalism, imperialism, or technological society often make similar arguments, that we are controlled not primarily through force but through the shaping of consciousness, through systems that make themselves appear inevitable. The culture industry, to use the Frankfurt School's term, functions like the archons, producing content that reinforces existing power structures, that keeps people focused on consumption and spectacle rather than questioning fundamental assumptions. Social media algorithms that create filter bubbles, showing people only what reinforces their existing beliefs, operate like the planetary spheres that trapped souls in predetermined patterns. Surveillance capitalism, which profits by predicting and manipulating behavior through data extraction, parallels the archontic control of fate through astrological influence. The Gnostic concept of Heimarmene, fate or destiny imposed by the archons, resonates with modern understandings of social determinism. Our life outcomes are powerfully shaped by factors beyond our control. The family we are born into, the historical moment we inhabit, the economic system we participate in, the cultural narratives we absorb. Most people live their entire lives within the parameters set by these forces, never questioning them, never imagining alternatives. The Gnostics would say these people are trapped in the demiurge's creation, mistaking the prison for reality itself. But the Gnostic texts also warn against something that seems remarkably prescient in the digital age: the danger of creating new prisons in the attempt to escape old ones. When Yaldabaoth constructed his false heavens, when he created a complete cosmos with its own laws and logic, he was not consciously trying to imprison divine sparks. He was simply doing what came naturally to his ignorant nature. He believed he was creating something good, something orderly, something that reflected his own glory. Are we not doing something similar with our technologies? We build virtual worlds, artificial intelligences, systems of total surveillance and control, believing we are creating progress, efficiency, security. But from a Gnostic perspective, we might simply be constructing more elaborate versions of the seven heavens, more sophisticated archontic controls. Every technological system that mediates our relationship with reality is potentially another veil between us and direct experience, another layer of simulation that makes the divine spark harder to recognize. The Gnostic warning about the demiurge declaring "I am God and there is no other" also seems relevant to modern forms of fundamentalism and ideological certainty, whether it is religious fundamentalism that claims exclusive access to truth, nationalist ideology that declares one nation or race supreme, or scientific materialism that insists physical reality is all that exists. Any system that declares itself complete and denies the possibility of something beyond itself operates with demiurgic logic. The truly ultimate reality would not need to assert its supremacy or deny alternatives. Yet the Gnostic response to these forms of control and deception is not political revolution or technological reform. The Gnostics were not trying to overthrow the Roman Empire or create a more just social order. They were focused on individual liberation, awakening the divine spark, escaping the cosmic prison, returning to the pleroma. This has struck some modern interpreters as quietist or escapist, a spirituality that accepts injustice in the material world because it sees that world as irredeemable anyway. Critics from the political left have sometimes seen Gnosticism as the ultimate opiate of the masses, not just promising heaven after death as Marx accused Christianity of doing, but teaching that the entire material world is evil and escape is the only option. If oppression and suffering are inevitable features of existence in matter, not correctable problems with practical or political solutions, then why struggle for justice? Why not just focus on personal enlightenment and leave the world to its fate? This criticism has some validity, but it also misses something important in the Gnostic vision. The Gnostics recognized that systemic evil was not primarily about bad individuals making wrong choices, but about flawed structures generating inevitable outcomes. The prison was the problem, not the particular guards who maintained it. changing guards, replacing one emperor with another, one economic system with another, would not fundamentally alter the situation if the basic structure remained. Modern revolutionaries have often learned this lesson through bitter experience. The overthrow of one oppressive system frequently produces another, sometimes worse than what it replaced. The Soviet Union replaced the Tsar but created new forms of totalitarian control. Liberation movements become new elites. The most fervent idealists, once in power, often prove as corrupted as those they replaced. The Gnostics would say this is because the problem is not particular people or even particular systems, but the nature of material existence itself. Power corrupts because power operates through the logic of the archons. Yet perhaps there is a synthesis possible between Gnostic insight and progressive politics, if we understand that we are fighting not just against particular injustices, but against patterns of consciousness that perpetuate oppression, against the internalized archons that keep us complicit in our own domination. Then spiritual liberation and political liberation become complementary rather than opposed. We need both to transform external structures and to awaken internal consciousness. We need both to resist the archons and to recognize the divine spark. Some modern Gnostic influenced thinkers have attempted this synthesis. Philip K. Dick, the science fiction writer, developed a late-life theology heavily influenced by Gnostic texts. In his Exegesis, an 8,000-page journal of metaphysical speculation, Dick argued that the Roman Empire had never ended, that we still lived under its control through the institutions and ideologies that descended from it. The divine was breaking through, creating cracks in the Black Iron Prison, moments when the true nature of reality became visible. Art, literature, and especially science fiction could be tools for seeing through the illusion, for awakening others to their imprisonment. Dick's paranoid vision, reality as a prison maintained through deception, truth as hidden behind layers of false appearances, liberation as requiring both gnosis and resistance, captured something essential about the modern condition. We live in an age of unprecedented information, but declining certainty about what is true. We have access to more knowledge than any previous generation, but feel increasingly controlled by systems we cannot understand. We are connected to billions of people through technology, but experience epidemic levels of loneliness and alienation. The Gnostic diagnosis of reality as a fundamentally problematic prison seems, to many, more accurate than the Orthodox promise that creation is good and serves divine purposes. The ongoing war between light and darkness that the Gnostics described cosmologically, we might now understand psychologically, sociologically, politically. It is the struggle between consciousness and ideology, between authenticity and conformity, between seeing clearly and accepting comfortable illusions. The archons are still here. They have just taken new forms. The demiurge still proclaims his supremacy. He just uses different languages. Sophia still cries out. Her voice just needs new ears to hear it. As the sun rises over the desert near Nag Hammadi, illuminating the cliff face where the codices were hidden for 16 centuries, we might ask, what does it mean that these texts have returned? Was their discovery simply an archaeological accident? A farmer looking for fertilizer who happened to strike his mattock against a jar? Or was it, as some of the texts themselves would suggest, part of a larger pattern of revelation, the light reasserting itself after a long darkness? The texts themselves teach that the divine spark cannot be permanently extinguished. It can be buried, obscured, forgotten, but it persists, waiting for the right conditions to manifest again. The Gnostic communities that buried these texts were destroyed, but the knowledge they preserved survived. The orthodoxy that suppressed Gnostic Christianity thought it had won a permanent victory, but history proved otherwise. What was hidden has been revealed. What was forgotten is being remembered. This cyclical pattern, light descending into darkness, darkness attempting to extinguish the light, light rising again, is fundamental to Gnostic cosmology. It played out in the original myth. Sophia fell. The divine spark was imprisoned. The revealer descended to awaken the trapped light. It played out in history. Gnostic Christianity emerged, was suppressed, but kept resurfacing in new forms. And it continues to play out in individual lives. Consciousness descends into matter at birth, forgets its origin, then potentially remembers and ascends. The texts discovered at Nag Hammadi preserve one formulation of this pattern, shaped by the culture and language of late antiquity. But the pattern itself may be perennial, appearing in different forms across cultures and eras, because it describes something fundamental about consciousness itself. Perhaps the Gnostic myth, despite its historical specificity and cultural particularity, points toward a truth that transcends any single articulation of it. That truth might be stated simply: consciousness is not reducible to matter. The physical universe, however magnificent, however mathematically elegant, however vast in space and time, does not exhaust reality. There is something about awareness itself, about the sheer fact of subjective experience, that indicates a dimension beyond the physical. The hard problem of consciousness, why there is something it feels like to be conscious, remains unsolved because materialist frameworks may be fundamentally inadequate to the phenomenon they try to explain. The Gnostics expressed this through mythology and mysticism, speaking of divine sparks and spiritual realms. Modern philosophers express it through conceptual analysis and thought experiments, speaking of qualia and the explanatory gap. But both are pointing toward the same mystery. Consciousness does not seem to be of matter, even though it operates through matter. We are not simply our bodies, even though we cannot exist without them. We are not simply products of neural processes, even though our thoughts depend on neurons. We are something more, something other, something that partakes of a reality beyond the physical. If this is true, if consciousness has a transcendent dimension, then the Gnostic project of awakening becomes intelligible in modern terms. It is not about escaping to some literal heaven beyond the sky. It is about recognizing one's own nature as consciousness itself, prior to, and more fundamental than the particular thoughts, emotions, sensations, and perceptions that constitute ordinary experience. It is about shifting identity from the contents of consciousness to consciousness itself, from the particular manifestations to the underlying awareness that experiences them. This is the remembering of light, not learning new information but recognizing what one already is. The Gospel of Truth says, "This is the knowledge which they seek. They knew who they were before they came into existence." Before we identified with a body, before we accumulated a personal history, before we became trapped in the narratives and roles that constitute our ego, what were we? What is the awareness that persists through all changes of circumstance and stage of life? What is it that remains when everything else is stripped away? The ancient Gnostics believed this awareness was literally divine, a fragment of God imprisoned in flesh. Modern interpreters might be more cautious about making such metaphysical claims, but even a minimalist version of the insight that consciousness is primary and irreducible, that recognition of one's nature as awareness brings liberation from various forms of psychological suffering, is profound and potentially transformative. Many modern spiritual movements have rediscovered versions of this teaching without direct influence from Gnosticism. Advaita Vedanta, Zen Buddhism, and contemporary teachers like Eckhart Tolle or Rupert Spira all point toward a similar recognition, that the sense of being a separate self is illusory, that consciousness is our deepest nature, that awakening consists in seeing through the illusion of separation. These teachings differ from Gnostic Christianity in important ways. They generally lack the dualism and the dark cosmology, but they share the core insight about consciousness and identity. What makes the Gnostic formulation distinctive and perhaps especially relevant to the modern condition is its unflinching acknowledgement of evil and suffering. The Gnostics did not try to explain away the horrors of existence, did not claim that everything serves a divine purpose, did not ask us to have faith that cosmic justice would eventually balance the scales. They said, yes, the world is terrible, creation is flawed, existence in matter is suffering. This is not because we fail to see the good in it, but because the good is buried beneath enormous weight of matter and ignorance and control. Yet even this dark vision contains hope, because it insists that the darkness is not ultimate. The Gnostic texts end not with despair, but with assurance that the light remembers itself, that consciousness returns to its source, that the divine does not finally abandon its own. The gospel of truth concludes, "This is the gospel of the one who is searched for, which was revealed to those who are perfect through the mercies of the Father, the hidden mystery, Jesus the Christ." The mystery is hidden not because God conceals it, but because we have forgotten how to see it. It is revealed not as external information, but as internal recognition. Those who are perfect are not morally flawless but complete. They have recovered the wholeness that was lost in the fall, remembered who they were before they came to exist in matter. As the light continues to rise over the Egyptian desert, as scholars continue to study the texts and translators continue to refine their renderings, as spiritual seekers continue to find in these ancient words resonance with their own deepest intuitions, the Gnostic message persists. You are not what you think you are. This world is not what it claims to be. There is something more, something deeper, something truer. And the path to that truth lies not in believing doctrines or following rules, but in a recognition so simple and so profound that most people miss it entirely. The kingdom of heaven is within you. The light shines in the darkness. The divine spark has never been extinguished. All that is required is to remember, to turn attention away from the prison and toward the light, away from the contents of consciousness, toward consciousness itself, away from what we think we are toward what we actually are. This is gnosis. This is liberation. This is the end of the war between light and darkness, not through the victory of one over the other, but through the recognition that they were never truly separate, that the light was always present in the darkness, waiting only for eyes that could see it. The texts discovered in that jar in the Egyptian desert are not simply historical documents, fossils of a dead religion. They are invitations to an experiment. Try seeing reality through this lens. Try recognizing the divine spark within. Try living as if you were light trapped in darkness rather than darkness with occasional glimpses of light. See what changes. See what remains the same. See whether the remembering of light, the recovery of gnosis, the awakening to one's true nature makes any difference. The war between light and darkness continues, but not primarily out there in cosmic realms beyond the stars. It continues within consciousness itself, in each moment's choice between awareness and forgetfulness, between recognition and ignorance, between the courage to see clearly and the comfort of familiar illusions. The archons still whisper their lies. Sophia still cries out for redemption. The demiurge still proclaims his supremacy. And the light still waits, patient and eternal, for consciousness to remember itself. In the end, perhaps this is what the ancient Gnostics wanted most to convey, that the story is not over, that the drama continues, that each person is both prisoner and potential liberator. The texts they buried were seeds planted in darkness, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. Those conditions have now arrived. The seeds have germinated. What grows from them remains to be seen, but this much is certain. The light has returned to the world, and the world will never be quite the same. The remembering has begun.